The following compilation features unsettling and spine-chilling tales sourced from Reddit's horror communities. Reader discretion is strongly advised. These narratives may contain graphic descriptions, psychological distress, and themes that could unsettle sensitive individuals. Proceed with caution, as immersion into these eerie stories may provoke fear, unease, and sleep disturbances. Enter this realm of Reddit's creepy horror stories at your own risk, as the line between reality and the macabre may blur within these chilling narratives. Story 1. I'm indebted to a voodoo shop. Unlocking things that are meant to stay locked has always fascinated me. When I was a kid, I would go around the entire house getting my little digits on anything that was behind a closed door, even at one point getting caught by my parents emptying their sock drawer just because I felt like it. It was annoying to my mom, but my dad found it hilarious, and by the time I started middle school, my dad bought me my first lock-picking set behind my mom's back. Our little hobby we could enjoy with each other. I quickly gained infamy in middle and high school as the girl who could pick any lock that needed unlocking. I got into lockers, locked doors, and cabinets like nothing, and got in trouble plenty of times because of it. It was to the point that I was one more lock away from expulsion in my junior year. So with the threat of my murder at the hands of my mother if I was expelled, I quit lock-picking for the rest of my school career. Not cold turkey. Of course, I continued to practice at home and outside of school to my heart's content. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't using this to break into people's houses to rob them. That wasn't my style at the time, but I did use it to get into places I wasn't supposed to. Abandoned houses, off-limit areas, even just those random padlocks on the sides of bridges. Somehow I managed to stay out of trouble and graduate from high school. And it seemed that my life began to go downhill the very moment that diploma was given to me. A few months after graduation, my dad lost his job. My city was a large industrial zone, and it was heavily affected by the recession. The plant that my dad worked at had employed a good chunk of the town, and with its closure, plenty of people were now in danger of losing their homes. My dad was one of those people. Despite everything, he tried to keep an outward appearance of calm, but I could tell how badly he was affected by the mounting bills. At the same time, I was unable to find work right out of high school, as with the plant's closure, the job opportunities dried up faster than a sponge on a stove. College had never been something I had wanted to do, so I had banked on finding a job to maintain myself, but with so few opportunities now available to me, I decided to do something that until then I had sworn I'd never do. I started using my lock-picking skills to break into abandoned stores and take items to sell to others. If the store wasn't going to sell them, I sure as hell was. I eventually roped a few of my friends into a little team of robbers to help me. I think I did this mostly to try and justify my choices, since with other people with me, I could unlock the door and allow them to rob the place. It wasn't much better, but offered me some dissociation from the crime. On this day, my 3 other friends, Jess, Tom, and Jeff, were out late at night and hitting our 3rd and final store. Kneeling before the door, I was in the zone as I tried to get the tumblers to cooperate with me. But something about this lock differed from the thousands of others I had opened before. Every bit of progress I made was just as quickly undone. "Mace, hurry up, man. Someone is going to see us," Jess said in her usual tone of apprehension whenever we did this. Mace was my preferred nickname, since saying Macedonia out loud was certainly a mouthful to most people. I quickly waved her away as I suddenly started making more progress. My eyes grew wide as I felt the lock ready to give. What even was this store? I asked no one in particular, far too focused on the progress I was making on the strange lock. Jess wasn't much help as she continued looking up and down the street to see if anyone would notice us. Even though this entire section of town was completely abandoned by businesses, and especially by cops. "A voodoo shop," Tom said, as he tried to peer into the windows of the shop to try and see if anything could be seen. But on top of the fact that the sun was setting, the windows of the shop were completely caked in dust from the inside, making it completely impossible to figure out what was inside the store. By the look of things, this shithole was abandoned even before everything went tits up. Jeff sighed as he blew a cloud of smoke from his mouth. Along with Jess, he was serving as a lookout, though at that moment he was more concerned with finishing his cigarette. My grandma told me about this place, and that it was cursed or whatever. The fact it's a voodoo shop probably aids in that assumption, Tom said as he pulled his face away from the window and looked over at me. I had my tongue out as I fished around for the final tumbler, and finally, with one last satisfying click, I quickly grabbed the door handle and yanked it down. The old wooden door opened, and a small rusty bell jingled our arrival to the empty shop. "All right, kids, do your thing," I told my friends as I pulled my hook tool out of the keyhole and stood aside for them to enter the shop. Robbing wasn't my style. I got my thrill from unlocking the doors, not from stealing shit. Jeff and Tom were quick to enter the store, but Jess hesitated at the entrance. "I've got a really bad feeling about this mace," she told me as I carefully packaged my tools and placed them into my jacket pocket. Jess was always the scaredy cat in our group and acted sort of like our moral compass. Honestly, if things weren't so bad in the city, then she wouldn't be doing something like this at all. "It's gonna be okay, Jess. Just quick in and out like always." I smiled and patted her on the back. That didn't do much to reassure her, but it was enough to get her to enter the store. I leaned against the store wall and acted as the new lookout. If all went well, we could usually clear out an area as quickly as 15 minutes. Sure, that wasn't exactly enough time to get most of the valuables, but it was enough time to get a decent enough haul. I looked down at my wristwatch and watched the second hand tick away. It was eerily quiet, and it started getting on my nerves the longer it went on. There wasn't even any wind, not even a small distant break of glass. It was dead silent, and I suddenly started feeling like how Jess usually did. I stared back down at my watch and I felt vomit build up in my throat. Somehow in that short moment of panic, an entire half hour had passed. "Shit," I mumbled out as I looked back at the store. Not a sound came from inside, not any talking or even the sound of things getting moved around. It was like I was in a bubble of silence that let no sound whatsoever through. I stared at the entrance to the store and hoped that suddenly they would come bursting out of the store with the things they'd stolen. I started panicking the longer that it was taking them to exit. Finally, after a few more minutes, I reached out and opened the door to the shop. The sad, rusty bell jingled and announced my arrival. The inside of the shop was completely covered in dust and cobwebs. Jeff had been right in thinking that this place had been abandoned much longer than the other buildings we'd broken into. And yet the entire store was completely stocked with items for sale. Potions and charms lined the shelves, and by the cash register, there was an entire wall of voodoo dolls. Each of them was different and wearing clothes with black button eyes that seemed to follow me the more I walked around the store. "Guys?" I called out, wondering where the hell they even were. That eerie silence continued to follow me, and it was as if I could hear every single squeak of the floorboards and every breath I let out. There wasn't a single sign of my friends at all. I was about to leave and try to call them, but suddenly the ring of a bell pulled my attention over to the register. There, standing behind the register, was Jess, but she looked off, very off. She had a giant smile on her face, and her eyes were almost as large as her smile was. She slowly turned her head to look at me in a very janky way. Her eyes moved in a couple of directions before they focused on me. "We shouldn't have come here, Macedonia," she told me in a chipper voice that instantly put me in a fight or flight mode. In the 5 years I'd known Jess, she'd never once called me by my full name, and it immediately creeped me out. "Jess, what's wrong with you?" I asked her as I started backing up towards the entrance to the store. Her eyes followed me as she stayed still at the register. "Where are Tom and Jeff?" I asked her. She tilted her head at me and slowly narrowed her eyes at me, the smile never leaving her face. "They're dead," she said with a laugh I'd never heard her make. My heart started beating so fast that it felt like it was going to burst right out of my chest, and I quickly turned around to leave. Running to the door and grabbing the lever, I was shocked to discover that somehow it had locked itself from the other side. "What the fuck is going on?" I screamed. pounding my fists on the door before turning back around to look at Jess staring at me at the counter, her laughs turning into cackles as I noticed that something was sticking out of her back and forcing her to sway side to side as she laughed. Noticing that my eyes were focused on the foreign object sticking out of her back, the smile on her face somehow grew wider. I think she noticed. "Sir," she said through her cackles. I watched as her eyes rolled up inside of her head and someone began to stand up from underneath the register. The person was giant and gaunt, with a freshly pressed and clean suit that somehow fit him perfectly despite his frail appearance. His black hair was a mess of curls and knots, a stitched-up mouth curled up into a horrible smile, and his skin was whiter than chalk was, with buttons for eyes and more stitches that appeared to be keeping his head attached to his shoulders. "Shame on you for not introducing us, Jessica," he said with a hoarse southern accent. With his other arm, he reached below the register again and produced a top hat to complete his ridiculously horrifying look. Jess's eyes suddenly rolled back down and her head quickly jerked to look at the monster that was nonchalantly having an arm on her back. "But you already know who she is." "Sir!" She giggled at him before her eyes again rolled back into her head, and he pulled his arm out of her back with a sick, wet pop. Jess suddenly went limp and slammed her face into the counter, revealing that her entire backside had been ripped open and everything scooped out of her. My Miss Macedonia, ain't your daddy ever teach you not to break into stores?" the monster said with a yellow, toothy grin so giant he was about to rip the stitches right off of his face. I frantically looked around the store for anything to defend myself with as my eyes again settled on the lifeless body of Jess left on the register. I could only imagine what this sick fuck had done with Jeff and Tom. "Who the fuck are you?" I demanded to know from him, reaching into my pocket and trying to find anything that might protect me. But in the brief second that I looked down when I pulled out my mini pocket knife, he had somehow appeared before me, sending me into a screaming fit. He stood there for a moment as I began to cry and damn near piss myself. "Y'all are breaking into my store and don't even have the common courtesy to read the sign." He tisked in disappointment and pointed a blood-stained glove above my head. I thought he was about to finish me off right then and there, but instead, he was pointing above me. I spared a glance and looked at the wooden sign hung up over the door. Old King Creole's half-priced voodoo store. "King Creole," I whimpered as I looked back at his pale face. He nodded and took off his hat, doing a dramatic bow before me. "But please, sir, what we thought this place was..." He quickly held up a finger to my face and softly shushed me. Standing straight again, he slowly brought his finger to his mouth to continue shushing me. "Your friends already gave me the same spiel. That don't automatically make you in the right, I'm afraid," he said with a chuckle as he switched from shushing me to tapping his long fingers against his face in thought. "Now what am I going to do with you?" He was practically giddy with excitement over what he was going to do to me. Please, I'll do anything, just please don't hurt me," I screamed at him, feebly holding the knife in front of me. Something about what I said pulled him out of his giddy imagination. But the smile remained on his face as he suddenly grabbed me by the shoulders and shoved his entire face into mine. Anything?" he hissed with excitement. I half expected his breath to be horrendous, but oddly enough, it didn't smell like anything at all. That, along with his sudden interest in me, quickly got me to nod in agreement. "Wonderful. Then how about this? Macedonia, my dear." He let go of me and quickly ordered me to follow him as he practically skipped his way past the register. "Mum, Mace," I mumbled at him, but he was already too far away to have heard me. I sheepishly followed after him as I wiped my face of tears and boogers and placed the pocket knife back in its home. I quickly ran past Jess's dead body and just did my best to avoid eye contact with anything, following after King Creole as he took me into the back room and into his office. "In exchange for your life, Mace," that caught me off guard since he somehow had heard my nickname. "You'll do 5 jobs for me. Should be simple with a woman of your skills of lockpicking. In exchange for that, I shall promise that nothing will happen to you," he said with a smile, and he looked around his desk for something. It seemed too good to be true, and there was definitely going to be something attached to this, but at the same time, I couldn't really argue with him. If anything, these jobs would ensure that I kept on living at least a little longer. What kind of jobs? I asked him after some hesitation. He quickly spun around on his heels and produced a drawing for me. I looked down at it and was greeted by a flannel-wearing voodoo doll with a beard and a little axe to go with. What am I supposed to do? I asked him with some confusion. He chuckled and sat in his chair staring at me with his button eyes and creeping me out to no end. Break into that address and bring back that doll to me. Seems one of my store clerks sold him without telling me, and I'd rather have him back here safely in the store than out and about. I was about to ask what address, but it suddenly began to appear on the paper in front of me above the doll. That's one job. He held up a finger to me and wagged it back and forth. Complete this job, and then I'll contact you for another one at a later date. Understand? He asked with a smile. I stared at the paper and tried to work out the address in my head. It was local and was maybe a half-hour walk from our current location. Okay, I told him, folding the drawing and stuffing it into my pocket. I stood there awkwardly before I started turning around to go and do the job. Before he grabbed my shoulder from behind and draped a necklace out in front of my face. Almost forgot. You might need this. He chuckled as I held my hand out for the necklace and he dropped it into my hand. It was a simple rope necklace with a strange talisman attached to it. If that little fellow is causing you issues, just show him that. Should clear everything up. He patted my shoulder and finally let me out of his office. I could feel his gaze on me as I slowly and shakily made my way back out onto the shop floor and made my way to the door. Even when I was sure we had broken the line of sight, it felt like he was still staring deep into my soul. As I reached out to open the door, it opened for me and I quickly exited the shop. Despite that, it still felt as if he was watching me from somewhere. I panted softly as my knees gave out and I collapsed to the sidewalk and threw up into the street. As I wiped the bile from my mouth, I stared down at my watch and felt another drop kick to my stomach. According to my watch, that entire ordeal had lasted only a full minute. Terrified by the power that King Creole possessed, I quickly got up from the floor and went about heading towards my destination. The walk there was uneventful, but if you had seen me walking down the sidewalk, you would have thought that I was paranoid, which I most certainly fucking was, at every noise that was made near me. I looked back expecting to see that tall bastard following after me. Every 5 steps I felt the need to look behind me or next to me, or even fucking above me in the sky. My heart had calmed down a bit, but it was now again pounding as I neared my destination. It was one of the last nice suburbs left in the city, and the address pointed to it being a house in the neighborhood. I wasn't exactly new to breaking into houses, but this would be the first time that I would ever break into one that wasn't abandoned or condemned. The sense of paranoia that King Creole was following me suddenly turned into paranoia of someone from one of the other houses seeing me breaking in. I arrived at the house to find it completely dark. I swallowed a rising lump of bile and anxiety in my throat and dug into my pocket. Taking out the note, I double-checked to be sure that this was the place, and then pulled out my tools. I was fortunate enough that the family living here had several plants on their porch, which served to keep me hidden from view. If you were to look at me and know I was there, it was obvious, but a passing person wouldn't be able to see me. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I attempted to pick the lock to the home. It was a simple lock, and yet my hand just wouldn't cooperate with me. I had the necklace that King Creole gave me tied up in my hand like it was some crucifix, and I was about to go fight some vampires. And this strange talisman thing was shaking around as my hands tried to do the thing that I had done countless times before. Just fucking. I was getting pissed at myself for not only not being able to pick a lock, but also for getting myself into this whole situation. But soon the rhythm began to return to my movements as I fished with my hook, tool, and was finally able to get the tumblers to cooperate and open the door for me. I let out a relieved sigh and quickly entered the house. I was glad to see that this family didn't have an alarm system, and this would hopefully be a quick job. The house was dark and illuminated only by the setting sun, but I was still too scared to turn the lights on, so I made do with the limited amount of sun that I had to work with. I quickly made my way into the living room and frantically began searching for the voodoo doll. It was when I was looking under the couch for it that I heard a rhythmic slapping sound, like someone hitting a wet mop against a hard surface. At first, I thought it was someone coming down the stairs, but after a few seconds, it continued. I tried to ignore it and continue my search for the doll, but it was soon obvious that it wasn't in the living room. I looked over at the family pictures and saw that they had a kid, which made me even more ashamed of what I was doing. But it also showed me that the doll was mostly likely upstairs in their son's room. As I made my way over to the staircase, that sound grew louder and louder. On instinct, I pulled out my knife again and started slowly making my way up the staircase. As I did so, the sound grew louder, but was also coupled with a cracking sound. As I made it to the top of the stairs, the carpet on the stairs suddenly became very soggy. In the dim light, I thought that maybe their bathtub had flooded. But as I leaned down to touch the carpet, I was horrified to see that it wasn't water. It was blood. The puddle of blood was coming from the room just to the left of the stairs, and against my better judgment, I took a peek inside. I was horrified to see a man in a flannel swinging an axe down over two horribly mangled corpses. That's where that sound had been coming from. I was able to put two and two together to realize that this guy had been the voodoo doll, but I had no idea how I was going to get him back to King Creole. But that wasn't going to matter if I was about to end up like the family here. I started back down the stairs, but I hadn't noticed how far the blood had traveled, and my first step resulted in my falling down the stairs and landing flat on my ass. I sat there, stinging in pain all over, before I was suddenly horribly reminded about what I had just seen. I quickly looked back up the stairs and had to cover my mouth before I screamed. The axeman was staring down at me with a crazed look on his face and smacking the blunt part of his axe against his palm. First day of freedom and I already get to kill someone else. His husky voice chuckled as he started walking down the stairs towards me. He cackled as he slapped the axe against his palm with each step he took toward me. I quickly looked around for anything that could help me and suddenly remembered the necklace. "So stay back," I screamed out as I held up my hand with the talisman wrapped around my hand. He reached the end of the stairs and kept coming toward me as I frantically backed up. I held it up toward him and prayed that it would do something. He lifted the axe over his head and was about to bring it down on me when a sudden flash of bright light enveloped the two of us. The axe fell right between my legs and got me to scream out in fear. But as I blinked away the last of the blinding light's effects, I saw that the axeman had disappeared. Replaced with the voodoo doll of him, I sat there for a few seconds before I let out a few pained laughs. As I picked up the doll from the floor, I suddenly started hearing crying coming from upstairs. I looked up and saw the son staring down at me and crying. It was certainly some consolation that he hadn't been killed, but now there was the issue that he had seen me. "Hey, sweetie," I told him. He must have been no older than 7 or 8. "It's okay. I took care of the bad man. You just call 911, okay? Can you do that for me?" I asked him. He sniffled and quickly nodded before walking over to another room, which I assumed was one with a phone. I quickly stuffed the voodoo doll into my pocket and left the house as quickly as I could, not even bothering to lock the door since the cops would most likely be not too far behind. When I returned to the voodoo shop, Creole was simply ecstatic to see me. And when I produced the voodoo doll, I thought he was going to die from happiness. I watched as he took the doll from me and pinned it back to the wall of voodoo dolls. There were so many of them, and I got the sudden and horrible realization that they were all people turned into dolls. "You did a wonderful job." "Mace!" he told me with a hard slap to the back. "That's 1 down and 4 to go," he said with a happy chuckle. I felt my knees wobble at the thought of what he was possibly going to make me do now. It wasn't like I would be able to tell him no. I didn't want to end up like my friends, or like the people turned into voodoo dolls on his wall, or even worse if I were to tell him no. So for the time being, I'm in his debt until I can pay it off. Fuck my life. After completing my first task for King Creole, I couldn't leave my room for days. I was lucky that he didn't seem to have another task for me right after retrieving his lost axe-murdering voodoo doll. That left me time to rot in my room and frantically clip at my nails with a nail clipper, something I did whenever I was in an especially horrible mood.
If my dad hadn't entered my room,
I probably wouldn't have had any nails left to clip. "Hey, sweetheart," he said as he entered my room. I could tell just from his tone of voice how exhausted he was. He'd gotten 2 jobs to cope with the loss of his factory job, but these jobs were hard work for barely enough pay. He was working himself to the bone for me and my mom, and yet he was still here trying to check in on me. "What's the matter? You haven't left your room in days," he asked, and sat down beside me in bed, quickly taking my nail clippers before I could destroy any more of my nails. "I did something really bad, Daddy," I said as I tucked my knees under my chin. I couldn't begin to figure out how to tell him that my now dead friends and I had pissed off some evil voodoo man, and no, I was forced to do his bidding until he decided that I had sufficiently served him, and I still wasn't convinced that he wouldn't kill me at the end of my tasks. "Judging by your expression, you can't really find a way to explain it to me." "Huh?" he asked me as he put an arm around me and pulled me close to him. He could read me like an open book and always seemed to be able to read my mind, although I doubt he couldn't even begin to understand my situation. "Whatever you've gotten yourself into, sweetie, I know you can get yourself back out of it. And if not, I will always be here to help you no matter what. Understand?" It was just the kind of thing my dad could always tell me to make me feel better. Just that simple affirmation that he would always be here was enough to keep me going. I pulled my face out from my knees and offered him a small kiss on the cheek and a smile. "Thanks, Daddy. You're the best," I told him as I wiped the tears in my eyes. He nodded, wrapping an arm around me again, and pulled me to him, kissing me back. He left soon afterward to collapse into bed until he had to wake up for another shift. I sat in bed for a few minutes before standing up and leaving my room for the first time in days. And as if on cue, my phone began to ring in my hands. I looked down at it and felt my blood freeze as I saw who was calling me. King Creole was the contact who was calling me, and yet I had never given him my phone number. I hesitated to answer and contemplated even hanging up on him or letting it go to voicemail, but I wasn't about to bring whatever voodoo powers he had on top of my family, so I answered it after a few seconds of indecision. "The marvelous Miss Mace." I was beginning to think I had the wrong number. Creole's southern accent came pouring out of my phone. That didn't make much sense to me, since he somehow knew my phone number and had even somehow gotten my phone to know it was him. So I chalked it up as some kind of joke he was making. "What can I do for you, sir?" I asked him how a minimum wage worker might respond. If he was upset by my lack of laughter or joy in his call, he certainly didn't let it show as he continued with his cheery call to me. "Drop by the shop, and I'll let you know what I need returned to me. Take your time," he said with a chuckle as he hung up on me before I could answer him. I sighed as I let my phone drop to my bed and groaned loudly. I shoved my face into my hands and felt like ripping it off, but I needed to do these favors if I didn't want to end up like my friends. So after a couple of slaps to my cheeks, I left my room and quickly ran past my parents and into the street. The walk to the shop was uneventful, and soon I was again standing in front of the shop. It felt strange being back here. I had a horrible feeling about this place now that hadn't existed when I had first broken in. But I didn't have a choice, so sucking it up as much as I could, I entered the shop, the sad roozy bell heralding my arrival. "Mace, so lovely to see you again." Creole was waiting for me at the register and had his hat on the counter in front of him. Come. He quickly waved me over as he stood back up and quickly placed the hat back on his head. Underneath the hat was a small voodoo doll. It didn't appear to be anyone specific, and it was staring up at me with a stink eye. It clearly wasn't happy to see me at all. "What's my task this time, sir?" I asked, trying to keep my disdain for him at a minimum. It was hard to be enthusiastic around him, especially with what I had already done for him. But whatever enthusiasm I lacked, he made up for it in spades. "I'm so glad that you asked." "Mace!" he said as he put his arm around me and pulled me into his chest. He didn't have much of a sense of personal space. I went practically limp as he pulled me behind the register and sat me down on the chair behind it. "I need you to break into another house. But this time, you're going to get me something I want, instead of something I lost. Once his sentence was done, he let out a little hum at the end. His excitement just pissed me off. What exactly is it, sir? I asked him, losing the battle of making it look like I gave a shit anymore. He held up a photo between his fingers and flipped his wrist to show me the full photo. Staring back at me was an ornate clock that seemed to be made of gold and encrusted with rubies. Are you asking me to break into a museum? I asked sarcastically. This clock looked like something that belonged at Versailles, and certainly not something that would be so easy for me to steal. I can assure you it's not. If that was the case, I could easily find an easier way of getting it. No, I got a tip about it selling on the underground art market, and I've wanted this here clock for quite a while, so be a doll and go get it for me, he said with that creepy smile still plastered on his face. I couldn't get used to him, his overly cheery demeanor, his stitches, his button eyes. Everything about him just screamed at me to run away, and yet I couldn't. I sighed and reached out for the photo. But before I could take it, he quickly pulled his hand back and produced his other gloved hand to me. In that hand was a pair of earplugs. What are these for? I asked him hesitantly. I took them and examined them. They appeared to be just normal earplugs. Something special about that clock. Otherwise, I wouldn't be too interested in it. He told me through a large smile and chuckles. It's in your best interest that once you break into this house, you put these on. He twirled his fingers at me and produced the photo which had been in his other hand. What if there's someone there? I wouldn't be able to hear them. I took the photo from him and looked down at the address which again appeared magically on the photo. It was in the same neighborhood as the axe-murdering voodoo doll had been in. I doubt there'll be anyone left to worry about, he said with another hummed-out melody. Just as I was about to turn and exit the shop, loud banging began emanating from somewhere behind Creole. What the fuck? I said as my heart nearly exploded from the startlement. The look on Creole's face just further chills up and down my spine. I was so used to seeing that stupid smile on his face that seeing the scowl that crawled across his face as he turned his head toward the source of the banging nearly caused me to shit myself. Mace, be a doll and go out and do your task. Please, I have some other business to attend to, he said as he produced his cane from thin air and began walking toward the back room. I thought he was going towards his office, but instead, he headed straight down towards what I figured was the basement. I wasn't about to be around to see whatever he was going to do, so I quickly shoved everything into my jacket pocket and exited the shop as quickly as I could. I was halfway down the street before I realized that I had left my house so quickly that I hadn't even bothered to bring my lockpick kit. Groaning, I made a U-turn and started jogging back toward my neighborhood. I got there just in time to see my dad leave for his next shift. I waved bye to him as he drove away and quickly entered my house. Mace, honey, my mom called out as I entered the house. She poked her head out of the kitchen and waved at me. She looked just as exhausted as my dad looked, since she had also had to start working for the first time since I was a toddler. Hey, Mom. I'm not back for long. I just forgot something, I said as I started up the stairs toward my room. Have you seen Jess lately? Her mom is worried sick about her. I froze at the entrance to my room as I heard my mom ask me this from downstairs. The memory of seeing Jess turned into a human puppet was still seared into my mind, her missing insides and that fucking smile that he had forced her to wear. No, not since we last hung out, I told her, not technically a lie. I quickly entered my room, swiped my lockpicks, and shoved them into my jacket pocket. Just as quickly, I made my way back downstairs to find my path to the front door blocked by my mom. You sure you haven't seen her? She asked me, clearly not believing me. I could understand her suspicion since me and Jess had such a close friendship. No, Mom, I haven't seen her since we last hung out together, I reiterated. I don't really know what my face looked like at the time, but my mom was moved by whatever it looked like. She nodded and moved out of the way for me. Are you okay? She asked me. I wanted to tell her no, I wasn't, But just like with my dad, I had no idea where to even begin with that story. I wish I could have told them both. It would have made things so much easier in the long run, but I just wasn't able to do so. "Yay, Mom, I'm okay," I lied to her, giving her a quick kiss on the cheek and leaving the house. Out of the corner of my eyes, as I turned to walk down the sidewalk, I saw her make the sign of the cross on herself and towards me. It made me feel a little better, but I wished that God could just strike me down right then and there instead. Walking toward the target neighborhood again, it felt like something was watching me. The paranoia was getting to me as I flinched with every single noise that came my way. When I crossed the street towards the target and a dog started barking at me, I thought that was it, and I was getting the K9. Instead, I was just faced with an especially cranky dog staring at me from behind a fence. Tossing him a stick to calm down, I quickly walked past him and toward my target. The house looked pretty much the same as the last house, especially in a suburb like this one. Pretty much every house looked the exact same. The main difference was the lock before me. It was another easy one for me, but this time there were two of them, and there wasn't anything to hide me from plain view. No pants to hide me or anything out on their front lawn either. Creole just had to call me for this job in the middle of the afternoon. I looked around quickly, and sure that no one was watching me, quickly went to work. I knelt right before the door and tried to be as small and inconspicuous as I could possibly be. The locks were simple enough, but my sweaty palms and shaking hands kept the process slower than I would have liked. The sound of an approaching car nearly sent me into a panic attack. I quickly stood up and shoved myself up against the corner of the door. Lucky for me, it was a passing car and took no notice of me. Fuck. I sighed as I stood there like some lame Halloween decoration for a few seconds to get my heart to calm down. Going back to work, the second lock was quickly dispatched and the door opened. Putting my tools back in their pouch, I quickly dug into my jacket pockets and pulled out the earplugs. I smushed them into my ears, and with a few quick breaths I entered the home. The first thing to strike me about this house was the amount of dust in the air. It was like this place had been abandoned for 40 years with the amount of dust up in the air. The next thing to strike me was the horrendous smell. It was like a strange mixture of citrus and pork, and it instantly sent my stomach into a revolt. It didn't make any sense. This house looked just as prim and proper as all the other houses. There was no way it was just left here to rot. Making my way through the entrance hall, I looked around for the clock, wishing that I could just take the earplugs out and follow the ticks it would be making. But remembering how Creole's advice and trinket had saved me from the axe-murdering voodoo doll, I quickly pushed my earplugs in deeper just to be sure. It didn't take me long to find the clock. It was prominently displayed in the large living room that the homeowners had. What was more shocking was the scene that I discovered in the living room itself. The source of the dust had been from there, and so was the smell. The smell which I discovered had been rot. Several people were present in the living room, though by the look of them not a single one of them was alive. Those further away from the clock were slowly rotting away, their bodies bloated and putrefied. That was enough for me to throw up on the floor and sit there gagging for a few minutes as I desperately tried to cover my mouth and nostrils. As you went further toward the clock, the decomposition spread. Some were skeletons or fragments of skeletons, and closest to the clock was nothing but piles of dust and bone shards. All of the bodies had their arms stretched out towards the clock, as if there had been a mad dash towards it. I was left speechless. If it hadn't been so horrifying, it might have been strangely beautiful, like some weird Renaissance painting or something. The trouble for me now was twofold: getting to the clock and somehow sneaking it out of the neighborhood. It was decently sized, maybe about 1 foot tall and 2 feet across, and there was no hope of me just shoving it under my jacket and walking nonchalantly down the street with it. Thinking it over, I elected to wrap my jacket around it and carry it down the street as if I was just holding my jacket. Good enough. I shrugged as I took my jacket and took a few nervous steps toward the clock. I half expected to begin turning into dust, along with however many people had been in this living room. But I figured that for it to have power over you, you had to hear it ticking. Stepping in the piles of dust and sending them airborne, I quickly held my breath to avoid breathing in the skeleton particles. I swiftly wrapped the clock up in my jacket and lifted it into my arms. I looked back behind me, expecting to see zombies or ghosts or fucking Bigfoot for all I knew, but the haunting scene remained the same. Seems as though it was a permanent fixture once you heard the clock. I didn't even want to fiddle with my earplugs, terrified that if I did they would fall out of my ears and I would hear the clock's mechanisms. Without any more thought toward it, I quickly made my way toward the door and out into the neighborhood. I let out a long and cathartic sigh and quickly began to walk towards the voodoo shop. It was the longest walk of my life, and not just because I had a cursed clock with me. I was scared about what other horrible things King Creole would have me do. This was only his second favor, and the first one had nearly killed me. And this second one had me carrying this cursed clock out in the open. Arriving at the shop was like taking off your bra on an especially hot summer day. Quickly opening the shop, I saw Creole at the register sewing one of his eyes back on. He turned the button in his hand towards me and smiled that stupid grin of his again. I was almost glad that I couldn't hear whatever bullshit he was saying. He motioned for me to bring the clock over and allowed his partially sewn-on button eye to dangle on his face. He was clearly more excited over the clock over the wound that he had received. I placed my jacket lump on the register and opened it up for him to look at. He was giddy with excitement and flicked the clock's face with his fingers. He then motioned for me that it was safe to remove my earplugs. I was worried he was tricking me, but remembering I still owed him 3 more favors, I removed the earplugs slowly and waited for my ears to adjust to the sudden influx of sound that had been denied to them. Excellent work. Mace! Creole was giddy with excitement as he examined the clock. He did tusk with annoyance as the dangling button eye kept softly patting him on the cheek with every movement. He quickly placed it back against his eye socket and with impossible speed quickly sewed it back on. That's much better. He sighed in contentment. What exactly is this clock, sir? I asked him, honestly and genuinely curious about it. I took a better look at it and realized that it was sort of in the shape of a crucifix. This is a monstrance clock, in more ways than one. He giggled, which got me to roll my eyes at his dumb pun. This particular clock has an aging curse on it. As long as it ticks, anyone who can hear it will die and begin to go through the process of decomposition. What stage you are depends on how far away you are from it. He was using his gloves to polish the clock, and I could tell he was very excited to have it. So, who were all the people in that living room? I asked him, pulling him away from his clock care routine. He stared at me for a moment with a blank expression before he seemed to process what I was saying. Some cult, I believe. They thought this clock would usher in the return of Christ or something. I guess in a way they did return to him. He made himself laugh uncontrollably at that. I groaned and turned my head towards the wall of voodoo dolls. They were all staring back at me and I couldn't help but get the goosebumps from that. That was until I noticed 2 familiar-looking voodoo dolls on the wall. The dolls were exact matches to what Jeff and Tom had been wearing. Quickly snatching them from the wall, I placed them down on the counter next to the clock and stared at Creole as he continued to giggle to himself. Let me buy them, I told him as I slid them closer to him. No, he told me straight up. Any sentiment of laughter and happiness was gone from his voice. That southern drawl had gone from annoying to terrifying in an instant. He was being serious. Well, why not? I demanded to know, reaching out for the Tom and Jeff voodoo dolls, but before I could grab them, they disappeared before my eyes. Your credit's no good here. Macedonia. Creole's voice had grown hoarse, and he was clearly in no mood to listen to whatever I had to say to him. Y'all are already in my debt, and I wouldn't want you going any further just to save your stupid friends. In fact, you should count yourself lucky that I don't place you on that wall with them. Or have my fun with you like with Jess. He stood up and reached a hand out to me, gripping my shoulder tightly. Go home, and wait for me to call you again, because if you don't leave now, I might lose my temper. He shoved me slightly and I quickly got the message. I reached out and grabbed my jacket from the register and ran as fast as I could out of the shop. If Creole had eyes, there would have been murderous intent in them. As I walked home dejected, I began to think back on what had just happened. A few weeks ago, Me and my friends were just breaking into abandoned places to steal some things and help our families through this hard time. Now, I was indebted to some evil voodoo corpse, and one of my friends was dead, while two other were turned into voodoo dolls. My life is fucked, and there's no other way to look at it. Maybe I should have gone to college after all. The time that elapsed between the next time King Creole called me was much less than the second time. He wasted only a day before calling me in the middle of a rare moment of spending time with my dad after he had finally gotten a day off. We had been holed up in the living room watching movies together when my phone began to vibrate in my pocket. Son of a bitch, I grumbled as I saw who was calling me. I held up a finger to my dad when he was about to ask who it was before I answered the phone and quickly stood up from the couch. Yes? I didn't want to call him sir in front of my dad, since the last thing I wanted was to have him think that I had some kind of job on the side that he didn't know about. I had also expected Creole to be still pissed at me after trying to buy the Jeff and Tom voodoo dolls. But he still sounded as cheery as ever. Mace, darling, sorry to interrupt your movie day with your dear old dad. Creole's voice laughed through the mic, making my blood cold when he mentioned my dad. I glanced over at my dad as he was barely paying attention to the movie and was starting to doze off on the couch. Y'all can finish your movie if you'd like, but as soon as you're free, I need you here at the shop. Something's come up that requires your lovely picking skills. Don't take too long, darling. He chuckled before hanging up on me before I could even respond to him. I let out a pained groan into my hand as I shoved my phone back into my pocket. I walked back over to the couch and plopped myself down on it, not even stirring my dad, who had fully conked out. It wasn't even that I was upset at missing the movie, since it was one that me and Dad had watched plenty of times together. I was just annoyed and sad that I had to work on the one day he had a day off. With the movie finishing up not long after I shook my dad awake. With a snort, he shot up from the couch, probably thinking that he was late to work or something, before he reorientated himself to where he was. Sorry, Daddy, I told him, smiling at the confused and tired look on his face. I'm going out for a bit. Okay? I told him as I quickly checked my pocket to ensure that I had my lockpick tools with me this time. I'd rather not have a repeat of having to run back home for them. Oh, okay, sweetheart, my dad said with a bit of relief. I figured he just wanted more sleep, so I guess it worked out for the both of us that Creole needed me for some other horrible job. I hugged him, and he made sure to give me one that succeeded in popping my back in several places. After he let me go, I went over to the front door and started making my way down to the voodoo shop. The sun was beginning to set on the horizon, which gave me some hope that this job would cause me less anxiety than the last two, but also scared me because it seemed like I was starting to get used to all this. The last thing that I wanted was to be getting used to this shit. I pushed all those thoughts to the back of my mind when I entered the shady part of town where the voodoo shop was located. As I rounded the corner down the street from where the voodoo shop was, my path was blocked by two guys I had known back in high school. Mace? Jacob? The taller of the two asked as he turned to look at me when he realized that I was standing awkwardly there. I wasn't close to Jacob at school. He was known as the drug dealer and wannabe gang member. He had been expelled from the school just a few months before graduation and had apparently disappeared off the face of the earth. And of all the places I could have run into him, it had to be near the voodoo shop. Hey, I said, looking at the two guys before noticing the small Ziploc bag being passed between the two of them. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt your business. I cleared my throat as I tried to just walk past them. It wasn't any of my business what these two guys did with their free time and money.
She a cop or something?
The mystery dude said, and it was obvious that he was tweaking. Nothing about me screamed cop, but in this dude's mind, I must have been the biggest narc in the city. I was just going to walk past them and leave them be, but the druggie reached out and grabbed me. Get the fuck off me, I shouted at him as I kicked him as hard as I could in the crotch. When my life is on the line, fighting dirty is most definitely on the table. The junkie doubled over in pain and gagged with pain with how hard I had driven my shoe into his crotch. Jacob backed up from me after I did that, and didn't try to stop me from continuing on my way. I got only a few more steps forward before I felt a hand reach out and grab me. Before I could turn around to deal with whatever was grabbing me, I also felt a sharp and intense pain in my neck.
You fucking cunt.
The junkie coughed out as I felt the pain increase in intensity, and warm liquid began seeping into my shirt. I looked down at my right side and cried out in gargled pain as I looked down at the knife sticking into my neck and being twisted around by the junkie. "You are a fucking cop, aren't you?" he screamed out as he pulled the knife out and stabbed it back into me. I tried to get away from him, but his grip increased on me, and I quickly felt my strength leaking out of me along with my blood. I could hear Jacob's voice, and he seemed to be distressed, but I couldn't tell what he was saying as the world began to spin, and I felt increasingly lightheaded. And before I knew it, I had somehow ended up on the sidewalk floor. I could hear screaming and fighting just near me, but my eyelids grew increasingly impossible to keep open, and I struggled to be able to breathe. Just before I lost consciousness, I felt like I was being lifted off of the floor. I thought that maybe I would be going to heaven after all. When I next woke up, I was inside the voodoo shop, inside King Creole's office. I was sitting down on a plush upholstered chair and felt like I had just been run over by a steamroller. When I tried to move even a muscle, I found it impossible to so much as move my pinky. "Goodness, you're awake already." Creole's voice frightened me for a second, as the silence was suddenly broken by it. He walked past me and sat down on a small stool that was in front of the chair I was sitting on. I have to admit, he looked absolutely ridiculous sitting on that stool, and it made me smile. And if I could, I would have probably laughed. When I tried to open my mouth to speak, only a horrible croaking sound came out, and that scared me more than anything else. The feeling of hearing your voice in your head and not matching what comes out of your mouth is terrifying. I wouldn't recommend talking at this moment. "Mace, my darling," Creole told me as he was busy picking a few items off of his desk before swiveling on the stool back to face me. "That addict did quite a number on your throat." He had needle and thread in his hand, and I was apprehensive about letting him near me with those things, but it wasn't like I had much choice in the matter. So I allowed him to sew my neck up, and to my surprise, he finished almost as quickly as he started. My mama taught me how to sew real well. He chuckled as he produced a long pair of scissors to cut the thread. "Now to help you recover your voice." He held up a small bottle filled with a deep blue liquid in it. "Drink this in one gulp," he told me as he handed the small item to me. I nodded and uncapped it, letting the small cork drop to his floor, but he didn't seem to mind at all as I tipped my head back and allowed the viscous liquid to slide down my throat. It had no real taste at first, but as more time passed, it left a slight taste of citrus behind. "How do I sound?" I asked after a few seconds of letting the liquid settle. My voice had returned, but it sounded very far away, almost like the last hint of an echo. Creole nodded and carefully patted me on the head. "It'll get stronger as time goes on. You're lucky I got to you in time. Any later, and I don't think I would have been able to save you in this state." He sounded sincere for the first time since I'd had the displeasure of first meeting him. And yet, even after being in his debt, he had still saved my life. "What about them?" I asked him, my voice still so quiet despite the fact I was trying to shout it out at him. Even Creole took a few moments to figure out what I was trying to say before that horrible smile I knew so well from him returned to his face. "Well, that horrible addict has been dealt with, but I've not yet decided what to do with Jacob." He chuckled, standing up from the stool, walking back over to his desk, and taking a seat behind it, while I was more than happy to hear that the person responsible for stabbing me had been dealt with, however horribly Creole may have done that. But in my mind, Jacob hadn't done anything wrong but try and get by just like I was. "Is there a way for you to spare him? I don't feel like he deserves to be hurt," I said as I slowly felt my strength returning to my body. It was enough to be able to sit up in the big comfy chair he had sat me down in. This seemed to catch Creole off guard, and he stared at me with his giant button eyes for a moment. He hummed in thought for a moment. "I suppose I can consider it." He shrugged his shoulders as he leaned back in his chair. "But for now, You still have a job to do. Darling, he said with a smile and stood up from his chair excitedly. I was about to complain to him,
Mostly about the fact I had almost been murdered a few minutes ago.
but I didn't have any arguing points. What is it this time? I asked, startled at the slight increase in the volume of my voice. Creole kicked the stool out of the way and dangled a doll in front of me. It was a small puppet held up by strings, and I noticed that he didn't have one of those puppet controllers. The strings were coming out of his fingertips. A couple came in here with their child today, and while their backs were turned, the kid took a voodoo doll off the shelf. The little doll danced in front of me, and it took me longer than I should have probably realized that the doll resembled the junkie to a frightening degree. And you need me to get it back? I finished his statement and he nodded excitedly. Is it in the same neighborhood as the last two? I asked, really just wanting to keep talking in the hope that by doing so, my voice would return faster. To my surprise, he shook his hand and turned his gaze down to the puppet. Suddenly, in the puppet's little hands was a drawing. This address should be more familiar to you, he said with that creepy, happy smile plastered on his face. I reached out and took the drawing from the puppet, and when I did that, the strings retracted into his fingertips, and he gripped the puppet tightly in his fist when it came up along with the strings. I shuddered at his sudden display of violence and looked down at the drawing. And to my shock, I was presented with an address that was in my neighborhood. I quickly looked back up at him, and he stared down at me, his size causing me to cower deep into the comfy chair. I'd gotten used to the routine of going to some stranger's neighborhood, but this was in my crib, and there was a chance that I knew these people. It ain't gonna be a problem. Is it, my darling Mace? He reached out and held my face in his gloved hand. I shook my head quickly and stood up quickly. All my strength returned just to get me away from him. Something told me that a dick kick wouldn't do anything to him, so it was better just to get as much distance between us as possible. I'll get right on it, sir, I told him, stuffing the drawing, which I hadn't even paid attention to, into my pocket. Right on it, I repeated as I turned to leave his office. I walked past the basement door and was startled by the frantic banging that greeted me as I did so. I panted softly as I turned into the main shop and was again startled when I saw that Jacob was tied up with a gag stuffed into his mouth. He was sitting down in the register chair and he frantically screamed at me, though it was nothing but muffled nonsense. Don't worry about him, Mace, Creole told me as he suddenly appeared behind me and gripped my shoulder tightly. I'll take good care of him. He laughed softly, a different tone from his normal cheery chuckles. This was a laugh that curdled my blood. Jacob's eyes were wide with fear as he stared at me, and he mumbled toward me. I shut my eyes as tightly as I could and simply ran toward the front door. I had my own problems to worry about. I couldn't be worrying about Jacob. In truth, I didn't want to end up like him, and maybe that's why I ran away so quickly and so blindly. I was already back in my neighborhood before I realized it and came back to reality. It only then occurred to me to check on the damage that had been done to me. I pulled my phone out and dared to point the selfie cam at my neck. I nearly burst out in tears at the sight of the gnarly stitching on my neck and throat. I quickly shoved my phone back into my pocket and did my best to pull my shirt up a bit to hide the horrible wound under it, though it didn't do much but succeed in making me look more shifty. I pulled the drawing out of my pocket to double-check the address, and only then looked down at the voodoo doll I was being sent to retrieve. It looked smaller than the others in the drawing. Creole had made the effort to make it smaller in the picture, and it appeared to be a child wearing an outfit I'd describe as a 1950s aesthetic. I could only imagine what this poor kid was going to have unleashed on themselves. I sighed and hoped that I would get there before it was too late. I arrived at the home and was immediately glad that it wasn't someone I knew. And by the looks of it, the parents were still at work as no car was in sight, though there was the possibility of it being in the garage. What turned me off instantly, though, was the sight of a home defense advertisement on their front lawn, meaning I only had a certain amount of time before their alarm went off. I was about to whisper a curse when I suddenly felt my pocket get significantly hotter. I quickly reached into my pocket and pulled out the drawing. To my surprise, it was on fire, but only on one side, and that soon quickly ended. Smoke rose from the drawing, and I was greeted by both a message and a code. "Figured you might need this." "KC," the message said. That feeling of being watched returned to me, and the hair stood up on the back of my neck. I quickly reached into my pocket and pulled out my tools to get to work on this. The quicker this was over, the quicker I could ask him to somehow cover up this scar on my neck. I reached the door and quickly got to work. I hated to admit it, but the locks here in my neighborhood were nowhere near as good as the ones in the rich suburbs were. It was like picking a cheap padlock used on a bike, because before I knew it, the door was open, and I was quickly scrambling inside to input the code to deactivate the alarm. Once that was done, I quickly went about looking for the doll. If the kid had taken it, it was obvious to begin searching in their room. I walked past some family pictures and confirmed my thinking that the kid had been a girl. It would make sense for her to take a small doll that was seemingly made for little girls. Like a horrible haunted American Girl doll. As I started up the stairs, I started hearing giggling and laughing. Not malicious or anything. The sounds of children playing. I arrived outside the girls' room and did my best to try and peek in without being noticed. Two girls were sitting on the bed and giggling with each other, and one of them was wearing the same outfit as the voodoo doll, which meant that I was too late, and I had no talisman to change the little girl back into a doll like I had done with the killer lumberjack. I had no idea what to do. Leaving the girls to play, I quickly went into the other room across the hall, which turned out to be a spare bedroom by the look of it. I silently closed the door behind me and quickly pulled my phone out to call Creole. The phone rang for an agonizing amount of time before he finally picked up. I wish he hadn't, because as soon as he did, loud screaming came pouring out of the mic. It soon quickly subsided into gargles that resembled the ones that I had made when I had been stabbed in the neck. "Mace, to what do I owe the pleasure of your call?" Creole asked me as he struggled against something on his end. I was quickly regretting this call, but if he wanted me to do something about this little girl, I needed him to give me something. "Sir, the voodoo doll has become a little girl, and I don't have a talisman to turn her back," I told him quickly, keeping my already quiet voice down, which was shockingly quiet. I swear to God, I must have sounded like a mouse to him. "Ah, well, that is unfortunate. I had hoped that you might be able to get to her before that happened. Lil Miss Sarah is quite the manipulator, especially with fellow children." He hummed into the receiver as he was thinking about something. I nervously tapped my foot on the carpeted floor and looked at the door separating me from the girls. And my eyes widened as I saw the door slowly close. "Sir, I think they might know I'm here," I whispered into my phone. There was silence on his end, and I looked down at my phone to see if he'd hung up on me. "Sir?" I asked with desperation in my voice. I started nervously pacing around the room, waiting for him to answer me. "Get out of that house, Macedonia," he told me in a serious tone. He didn't have to tell me twice. I was already heading for the door to get out of the room and out into the hallway. I opened the door and started making my way toward the stairs. Just before I could reach the first step, I felt two pairs of small hands shove me down the stairs. My phone flew out of my hand as I came tumbling down to the first floor. The second time on one of these jobs I'd fallen down a flight of stairs. "Great job." A small southern voice shouted out. I groaned and rolled over on my back, quickly met by someone sitting on my chest and holding a knife to my neck. This was quickly turning into the worst day ever, almost on par with when I first met King Creole. When my vision finally focused on the tiny figure straddling my chest, I saw that it was the living voodoo doll girl. She was wearing a small 50s-style dress with brown hair tied in pigtails. She looked almost like Shirley Temple, although I don't think she was in any mood to give me animal crackers. "What should we do now, Sarah?" a softer voice asked. Turning my head to the side, I saw standing behind us on the stairs was a little girl who also had pigtails. The voodoo doll, who was named Sarah, looked back at the little girl and then back down at me. A smile came across her face as she inched the knife close to my fresh stitches. "Call the police." I'll keep her here," she ordered the other girl. who quickly scurried off to go and find a phone. I stared up at the little girl and could tell from the look on her face that she wasn't a normal little girl, if the fact that she was a living voodoo doll was any indication of that being the case. "You're going back to the store," I threatened her. She giggled and poked the tip of her knife into the gaps in the stitches of my neck. I shuddered and tried to remain perfectly still as she silently threatened me. "You're stupid if you think he's going to let you go after you complete his tasks," she told me. She may have been a little girl, but he had the mind of a deranged killer by the sound of her. I believed her, of course. It was something I thought about often. What was going to stop him from turning me into a voodoo doll or something worse? "What choice do I have?" I asked her, wishing so badly I could simply just shove her off of me. But with how her knife was held at my throat, one wrong move, and I wouldn't have Creole close by to save me a second time. The little girl looked down at me and then back up towards upstairs momentarily. It's been almost 60 years and so much has changed. But I do know one thing. Sarah giggled maniacally as she looked back at me with a deranged look on her face. "I'm going to enjoy carving her like a pumpkin." She motioned toward the upstairs. I clenched my fists and without even thinking decked the little girl in the face, sending her flying off of me. I acted quickly and started running toward the front door. I barely got a few feet before I was tackled to the floor. The one time the cops arrived on time, and it had to be the time that I was running from them. I kicked and tried to get them off of me, but I realized real quickly that that wasn't going to get me anywhere and simply went limp. My first thought was how my mom and dad were going to react to this. As I was shoved into the police cruiser, I glanced over to the front door where Sarah and Em were standing staring at me. And Sarah had her arm wrapped around Em and staring with a sadistic smile at me. When I arrived at the police station, I was quickly booked and tossed into an interrogation room. I quickly sat in the corner of the room and curled up in a ball on my chair. All I could think about was how my parents were going to react to this. They had tried so hard to prevent me from going down this path, and here I was, under arrest and probably about to be thrown into jail. How exactly could I tell them that I was working for a living voodoo doll, tracking down his escaped voodoo doll children? I sighed as I fumbled around with the handcuffs that were on my wrists to pass the time. When the door to the interrogation room opened 3 hours later, I expected the stereotypical overweight cop to be interrogating me. Instead, I was met by a uniformed cop who looked like he'd just seen the most horrendous things that had ever happened. He fumbled around with his keys before unlocking my handcuffs and helping me stand up. "I'm so sorry. We had no idea of knowing that you worked for Mr. Creole. If you had told us that, we wouldn't have even brought you here." He was in an absolute panic. His words were going a million miles an hour, and it took me a few seconds to process everything. I rubbed my wrists, and he quickly exited the room and told me to follow him. The entire station was muttering to themselves as they saw me walk past them. "You guys know King Creole?" I asked the officer leading me toward the lobby of the station. He looked back at me and sighed as he held onto this bulletproof vest like every cop does. "We have an understanding with him. He keeps crime low. We stay out of his way," he told me in shame. My mouth dropped at that revelation. It all made sense. How the murders in the house with the lumberjack doll were never investigated, why my missing friends weren't found, why I was now suddenly being released without so much as a slap on the wrist. He had the police in his pocket. At the lobby of the station, I was met by a horrifying sight. I had expected Creole to be there to pick me up, but instead, it was Jacob. Or rather, what had once been Jacob. His eyes had been replaced by buttons, and he was as pale as Creole was. It looked like he had been cut straight down the middle and was being held together by stitches and metal staples. His mouth, unlike Creole's, was sewn shut and tightly. He bowed down at me as if I was someone important or royalty. "I take it this freak is with you?" the officer escorting me asked, to which I nodded and shuddered in fear. I hadn't known Jacob very well, but to see someone I knew at all turned into one of Creole's playthings again like Jess had almost sent me into a full-blown panic attack. I was reeled into Jacob's company, and he opened the door for me to exit the station, and to my confusion and horror, we had somehow stepped out into the voodoo shop. I looked back at Jacob as he followed me through the door and silently motioned for me to go to the register. I hesitated at first before following his instructions. He went in the back, probably to get his new boss, and left me standing before the counter. "Mace," Creole shouted excitedly, his entire body drenched in blood. I shuddered and stepped back as he took his place at the register, picked up the template doll from the register, and began tossing it up and down in his hand. "Quite the mess you caused. You left me to clean it up," he teased me as he continued to toss the doll up and down. "I'm sorry, sir," I apologized submissively, staring down at the floor like a child about to be scolded. It just all got out of hand. That could be used to explain my current situation or my entire life since first breaking into this hellhole. "Apology accepted. It felt nice to step out of the shop for once," he said as he stopped tossing the doll up and down and pointed with a blood-stained gloved finger toward the wall of voodoo dolls. I followed his gaze and saw that Sarah had been returned to voodoo doll form and was back on the wall, much higher up this time. Unfortunately, I didn't get there in time to save poor Miss Emily. He sighed sadly, his finger drifting down toward a doll just under Sarah. I covered my mouth in horror as I saw a doll that looked exactly like Emily under her. "What happened?" I asked him. He looked at me and held up his finger to his blood-stained face. "It's better you don't know," he hummed out. "Sarah was quite the little murderer back in the 50s. You wouldn't believe the amount of trouble I had getting her to walk into my shop," he said with a smile as he tossed the template doll back on the register and leaned in closer to me. "Even though you failed to get her back, I'll still count this as your favor done." He held up 2 fingers. "2 more to go." I nodded and reached up to pick at my stitches, just wanting some way to relieve the mounting stress and anxiety building up inside of me. "Do you have something to hide these?" I asked, pointing toward my wound. He looked at me and slapped the register table. I thought he was about to fly off the hinges and tear me apart or something, but instead, he looked shocked. "Dear me, where is my head at?" "Of course." "Darling, one moment. Jacob, my boy." He snapped his fingers toward the now mute Jacob. He went rigid like a soldier at attention, ready to receive whatever order his new boss had for him. "Go into my office and fetch the ointment for Lil Miss Macedonia here," he ordered, and Jacob dutifully nodded and walked back toward Creole's office. I was left alone with him as Jacob went to get my ointment. He stared at me with his button eyes for an uncomfortable amount of time. When the banging started up again from the basement door, I watched as his face contorted from his usual cheerily creepy smile to one of annoyance and rage. When Jacob finally returned with the ointment, it wasn't quick enough. I took it from him and was so happy that it came with instructions. I left the shop just as Creole stood up to go toward the basement. I applied the ointment as I walked along the sidewalk back toward my house. To my immense relief, I watched through my phone as the hideous scar and stitches disappeared before my eyes. I was left with a horrifying dilemma. When Creole was done with me, would he turn me into a voodoo doll or a mutilated living corpse like Jacob? The ointment that King Creole had given me was not permanent. Much to my shock and horror, when I woke up and went to the bathroom, I saw the giant scar and stitches staring back at me. Turns out, the ointment lasts only 8 hours before it needs to be reapplied, which was annoying, and forced me to have a timer go off just before 8 hours was up to reapply the ointment to my scar. Just another thing forced upon me because of my entanglement with King Creole. A week or 2 after my last job for him, I was rudely interrupted by him calling me again. I was in the middle of dinner with my mom. My dad was out at work on a late shift. I stared at my phone for a long time. Everything in me was telling me just to ignore him. It took everything in me to answer him and bring the phone up to my ear. "My darling Mace,"
Creole's excited voice greeted me,
causing an annoyed exhale to come out of my nostrils. "Sorry to interrupt dinner with your lovely mother, but an urgent matter requires your attention. Finish your dinner and then get your lovely self down to the shop. See you then." He didn't even bother waiting for a response, or let me respond at all. The call lasted probably all of 10 seconds. "Who was that?" my mom asked as he took a sip of her drink. I stuffed my phone into my pocket and picked at the chicken and rice staring back at me. My mom is a great cook, but it was hard for me to feel any kind of appetite when all I could think of was the horrible shit I had seen and had gone through. I had almost been murdered multiple times, one time being at death's door, and I had no one to turn to. Very hard to feel any kind of appetite after all that shit. Scam call, I told her, and I forced myself to eat an entire forkful of food. She nodded and kept eating her share of the dinner. After I had eaten enough to pass for a normal amount of food, I pushed my chair back and carried my plate to the sink, rinsing it out after I placed my leftovers back into the pan that they had come from. "Mom, I'm going out for a walk. Do you need anything while I'm out?" I asked her once I had finished with my plate. "No, sweetheart. Just be careful out there. Lots of weirdos out there nowadays," she said as she passed me with her empty plate. Oh, if only she knew the shit I was mixed up with. But I gave her a nod and a hug. I ran upstairs to my room to get my essentials. My lockpicking kit, and now a new weapon to my arsenal. Pepper spray. It might not exactly work on Creole, but it would stop a repeat of a knife ending up in my throat. As if to harp on that point, my timer went off, prompting me to go into the bathroom to quickly apply my ointment. It seemed that whenever it began to run low, and I had to think about having to go back to the shop on my days off, the container would always refill itself. So I guess that was a nice plus. With everything ready for my next horrible errand, I hugged and kissed my mum goodbye before leaving my house and heading in the direction of the voodoo store. Despite it clearly being labeled half-priced voodoo store, my mind constantly wanted to call it a voodoo shop. Something about it just rolled off the tongue better. Maybe Creole had a branding issue or something. The sun was just about to dip below the horizon, and the streetlight flickered to life, creepily illuminating my way towards the shitty part of town where the shop store was located. This time, thankfully, I didn't run into any drug dealers or crackheads, but my hands never left my pockets the entire time. I had my finger on the trigger of the pepper spray, ready for anyone that might want to jump me. But I arrived safely at the store and opened the door, the sad rusty bell signaling my arrival. Waiting for me at the register was Jacob. It hadn't gotten any easier to look at him. He was in a new outfit. However, before he had been in a suit similar to King Creole's, but now he was wearing a bellboy outfit. It was bright red with shiny gold trimmings. He looked like some sort of ornamental nutcracker or something with how new and shiny he looked. His stitched-up mouth was now curled up into a smile as he eagerly waved hello to me. "Doesn't he just look positively lovely?" Creole shouted excitedly, causing me to yelp in surprise as he suddenly appeared behind me. He wrapped his arm around me and led me closer to the register. Jacob took his hat off and did a little bow to me, and I awkwardly waved hello to him, more worried about getting Creole off of me. "He looks good," I said, shrugging his arm off of me and letting out a sigh of relief when he finally let me go. If he was offended by my shrugging his affection off, he didn't let it dampen his excitement over how Jacob looked. "Doesn't he? I wanted to try something new with him, and I'm absolutely adoring how he turned out," he shouted with giddy excitement. Jacob placed his little hat back on before bowing again and excusing himself to the back room. He left us alone, and I suddenly found the atmosphere much less inviting without him there. "So, how's business?" I asked him, trying to cut some of the awkward tension in the room. He craned his neck down to look at me. I could swear that his head was about to break its stitches, and his head would go tumbling to the floor with how he was staring at me. "It's great. Can't complain about it at all, actually." Creole let out a big chuckle before slapping me on the back hard and heading behind the counter, as if to escape any imaginary retaliation I might want to do to him. "Don't worry, Mace. I won't let you kill yourself with small talk," he said as he sat down in the chair that sat behind the register. "I need you to get me a mirror, a very special one." His smile dipped a bit. This was something serious. "What does it do?" "I assume since you want it, it probably isn't normal." I walked up to the counter and noticed that the voodoo template doll was staring back at me. "You catch on quickly," Creole snickered at me in a patronizing tone. "It's best if I don't tell you what it does. In fact, for your own safety, I'd advise you not even to glance at this mirror. He raised his arm and fluttered his fingers, a scrap of paper appearing between his index and middle finger. This place is also quite far away, and I know y'all aren't going to make it walking.
So I'll give you some help,
he said as he handed me the scrap of paper. I took it from him and looked down at it. It was only what I guessed was a room number. Where exactly is this? I asked, looking back up toward the register, only to find him not there anymore. I quickly spun on my heels to see if he was behind me, and sure enough, the tall bastard had somehow teleported over to the entrance to his shop. An abandoned hotel in Pennsylvania. Quite the walk for you, I know, he said with that stupid smile on his face. That was at least a several-day non-stop walk, and there was no way I was making it there without my parents noticing. How exactly am I to get to Pennsylvania? I asked him, stuffing the room number into my pocket. He giggled a bit as he motioned for me to come closer. I took a few steps over to him and watched as he again fluttered his fingers. Soft purple flames emanated from his fingertips. He proceeded to draw on the door, and I watched with a hint of wonderment as it subtly gleamed purple and then died down into nothingness. It's just a simple step away, darling. He opened the door for me, and I was more than a little surprised to see that the door didn't open to the outside. It opened to the lobby of a hotel. I quickly walked over and stuck my head through the door. The other side was an almost pitch-black hotel room with dust and cobwebs floating through the air. You might want this also, he said as he handed me an electric lantern. I nodded and grabbed it from him. I took a deep breath and entered the hotel. Remember, don't look at the mirror, he warned me before shutting the door behind me. I stared back at the door and stayed in place for a few seconds in the pitch blackness. It took me a few seconds to figure out how to turn the lantern on, but when I at last illuminated the lobby, I was more than happy. Not a single sound was being made in the hotel, not a creak in the floorboards, no wind blowing from outside, not even the sounds of rats scampering around. It was absolute silence. The only sound I could hear was my breathing. If it wasn't for the lamp, I might have thought I was in a sensory deprivation chamber. I fished the room number out of the pocket and stared down at it with the lantern. Room 1145. There were at least 11 floors to this hotel, and I knew for damn sure that even if this place had an elevator, there was no chance of it working. I walked over to the front desk and stared down at it. There was a bell there to ring for staff, but something in my gut was telling me that it would be a terrible idea to ring it. So I simply moved on and headed towards the stairs, following the signs that pointed me the way. While this place was abandoned, it also seemed to be frozen in time. As I walked past the kitchen and dining area, I was shocked to see food out and ready to be served. Breakfast foods were piled high and ready to be eaten. The coffee was warm, the milk was cold, and the fruit was fresh and ripe. It was like this place had been abandoned and left in limbo. This place is weird,
I mumbled to myself as I continued to walk towards the stairs.
I opened the door that led to the stairwell and was immediately blasted with the overwhelming smell of rot. It was enough to cause me to drop the lantern and let out a retch that echoed throughout the entire hotel. I quickly picked the lantern back up and ran back toward the kitchen. I grabbed a cup of coffee and quickly took a giant inhale of it just to get something else into my nostrils. Fuck, was all I could reasonably think of saying. Before I could even think about going back toward that stairwell again, I quickly picked up some giant napkins from one of the tables, the kind that you usually put on your lap, and wrapped them around my mouth and nose in a makeshift face mask, making sure to dampen it with coffee to give me at least something else just as strong to counteract the smell. With my makeshift mask ready, I once again braved the stairwell. It didn't take me long to find the culprit of the noxious smell. A pile of decomposed bodies was lying at the foot of the stairs. I couldn't even begin to count how many of them were there. As their limbs were all tangled together, I shoved my mask as close as I could to my nostrils and did my best to focus only on the coffee smell. Time may have stopped for food in this hotel, but dead bodies sure as hell still decomposed just fine. I was forced to step on them since there was no other way to begin climbing up the stairs. The sickening crunch and snapping of bones were enough to get another retch out of me as I desperately tried to focus on the smell of coffee. I moved as quickly as I could towards the stairs and began running up them as fast as possible. I didn't dare take off my mask until I reached the 11th floor. Opening the door to the floor, I quickly ran into the hallway and shut the door behind me. I took my mask off to see if I could breathe easier and was relieved to be away from the horrible smell of death. I was never more grateful for the smell of something normal. I stood there catching my breath after running up 11 flights of stairs and took a look around, moving the lantern up and down to see if anything else was up here with me. The halls were empty, but every single door on this floor had a do not disturb sign on the doorknob. After my breath was sufficiently caught, I started making my toward room 1145. The eerie silence was enough to start playing tricks on me. Every single step I took, it felt like something was following close behind me. I would stop and shine the lantern behind me, but there was nothing there. But every time I started walking again, I swear I could hear a second set of footsteps just after mine. When I arrived at room 1145, I was happy to see that the door was an old one. It didn't have the electronic locks that hotels have now. This one needed a key, and that's why I had been sent here. I sat the lantern down next to me and got my tools out, ready to work on his lock. I was surprised by how this lock acted. It was almost like the lock Creole used for the voodoo shop. The tumblers seemed to be changing constantly, and every time it felt like I was close to getting somewhere, all my progress was erased. Son of a bitch, I mumbled as I fiddled with the lock. I wasn't about to let some ancient, probably magic-infused lock show me up. So with way more brute force than skill, I started attacking this lock with everything I had learned. And to my immense satisfaction, I heard the satisfying click of the door unlocking. I quickly turned the doorknob, pushed the door open, and clapped with joy over how I had finally gotten through the lock. I quickly packed up my tools in their bag and stuffed them into my pocket. I made sure to look down at the floor just in case this freaky mirror was just standing there waiting for me to stare at it. I decided to use my makeshift face mask as a blindfold. I wrapped it around my head and reached my arms out to feel out in front of me. I left the lantern in the hallway since I was going in completely blind anyway. I patted my hands out in the darkness to begin building up my surroundings. It wasn't easy, and I bumped into pretty much anything and everything I came across. Finally, after a few minutes of bumping into things, I got a general layout of the room, but I hadn't figured out where the mirror was. It was then that it hit me. What size was this mirror? Creole hadn't said if it was a body mirror or a handheld mirror or the fucking bathroom mirror. Exiting back into the hallway, I took off my blindfold and tried to think of a better way of doing this. I looked back into the darkness of the room and then down at the lantern. I picked up the lantern and then tossed it into the room. Immediately, I could tell that there was no mirror right at the entrance, so I would be okay to enter at least there with some light. I walked in with the lantern and looked around where the light touched. With that crossed off, I picked up the lantern and looked around for something to cover up a side of it. Lucky for me, there were towels just hanging on the coat hanger on the door to the bathroom. I covered one side of the lantern so that light could only appear on one side. I then extended my arm out into the main room of the hotel and slowly began to rotate the lantern as if it was some sort of makeshift lighthouse. My thinking was that if it came into contact with a mirror, then the light would be reflected onto the wall, not illuminated by the lantern, since that side would be covered by the towel. And to my amusement, I was proven right when after a few turns, the light appeared on the other wall. Bingo! I giggled as I quickly pulled the lantern back and placed it back on the floor. Then I tied my blindfold back on and quickly went out in the direction in which I had pointed my light. After a few seconds of groping in the darkness, my fingers came into contact with the cold and slick surface of a mirror. I must have been smiling a big stupid grin when I reached it. I felt the mirror up a bit and figured that it was some sort of standing mirror. I tried lifting it and found it relatively light. Confident in my abilities, I started walking towards the door. Of course, in my excitement over finding the mirror, I happened to have forgotten where I had placed the lantern. I tripped over it and fell with the mirror down onto the floor. I groaned in pain and surprise. feeling like a dumbass over how I had forgotten the lantern. And when I looked up from the floor, I was shocked to see my reflection looking back at me. The fall had pulled down my blindfold. Shit! I quickly sat up and grabbed the lantern. I half expected that I would explode or spontaneously combust or turn to dust. But after a few seconds, nothing happened to me. I closed my eyes and reached out to the mirror and sat it up completely. The first time had been an accident, but the second time curiosity at last got to me, and I opened my eyes to look at the mirror. It was just my reflection. Nothing horrible about it, just me. I moved my arm around and did a few moves, and it followed it perfectly. It seemed like a normal mirror. Had I gotten the wrong one? That train of thought was quickly derailed when I saw that my reflection was smiling at me. When I for sure wasn't smiling, I backed up from the mirror, and yet my reflection didn't follow what I was doing. It just stared at me with a look of total malice in its eyes. I watched with complete and utter terror as it began to contort and change. My limbs grew gangly. It looked like some sick funhouse mirror version of me. Her nails grew longer until they had completely turned into claws, and my small stature was completely erased into some horrible, stretched-out version of myself. It would have been scary enough if that was all it did. But then she started crawling out of the mirror. Oh, fuck this. I screamed as I quickly turned around and started sprinting towards the stairs. I probably haven't run that fast since I was forced to run a mile in PE. My gym teacher probably would have loved the form I was using. It was probably textbook. I reached the stairs in no time flat, only to discover that it was locked. You gotta be fucking kidding. I screamed and began fighting with the lock. I looked back down the hall and screamed in absolute terror when I saw my reflection chasing after me on all fours like some skinwalker-looking thing. Her creepy smile was accompanied by some new, sharp and jagged teeth that were no doubt ready to tear me to shreds. She didn't even bother saying words to me, only cackling uncontrollably as she quickly closed the distance between us. I wasted no more time on the locked door and sprinted down the hallway to my right and was more than happy to see a fire escape warning above the door at the end of the hall. As I was sprinting down the hall, though, I could hear that my reflection was rapidly catching up with me. And I could feel that if I ran toward that door, there'd be no way for me to make it there in time. I was about to look behind me when I noticed one of the hotel rooms was open. In a split second, I changed directions and ran into the room, quickly slamming the door shut behind me. Locking and deadbolting the door. My reflection came slamming into the door, but the thick wooden structure withstood her attack for the time being. I lay on the floor, catching my breath for a moment, before I started looking around, either for escape or for some sort of defense. I fished in my pocket for my pepper spray and got it out. I didn't exactly know if my reflection would be affected by it, but having it with me gave me a little sense of safety. I was also glad that through my blind panic, I had somehow managed to keep the lantern with me. Any sense of safety was quickly erased when my reflection began banging on the door again, and I noticed cracks beginning to appear on the door. I couldn't waste any more time. I looked around and tried to find something or anything to get me out of this situation. I thought about calling Creole, but when I pulled my phone out, I was met with the dreaded no signal. With that idea expended, I looked around the room and discovered it was one of those rooms that was separated by another with a door. If I could pick the lock, I could sneak into the other room and maybe make it to the fire escape. Quickly pulling my tools out, I didn't bother wasting a second and began trying to figure out which tool would do the best job. All the while, my reflection was screaming an otherworldly scream and smashing herself against the door. To my immense relief, this lock didn't seem to have any magic fuckery infused into it, and in no time flat I had picked the lock and had managed to enter the other room. I dimmed the lantern and quietly closed the dividing door behind me. I waited in the dimly lit room until I heard the sounds of the door being broken down and my reflection entering the room. I was waiting at the door, and the moment I heard her enter the other room, I slowly opened the door and exited into the hallway. I could hear her tearing the room apart looking for me, and I started making my way toward the fire exit, as quietly and as quickly as I could. I was about 10 feet away from it when I heard her scream. I looked behind me and saw that she had exited the room and had seen me. I sprinted toward the door and flung it open. I half expected to be put outside, but instead, I came tumbling into the voodoo store. I was never more happy to see the dust-filled shop in my entire life. The fire exit had been linked to the front door of the voodoo shop, and I had ended up smashing into one of the shelves of shrunken heads. "Mace, goodness darling, you in some kind of rush?" Creole asked, as I heard his footsteps and cane rapidly approaching me. Before I could even look at him, though, I looked back at the door and reached out towards it. "Quick! Shut it!" That was all I got out as my reflection came sprinting towards me. She leapt through the door and was about to lunge toward me when Creole swung his cane like a baseball bat and sent her flying into the glass window of the shop. The hit must have knocked her unconscious as she went limp after she hit the floor. "I see you looked at the mirror," Creole said in clear disappointment. I stared up at him and then over toward my corrupted reflection. I quickly put him between me and her and did my best to try and explain how it had all happened. I must have been talking a million miles an hour, and yet Creole seemed to understand everything completely. "I see, so it was an accident," he said after I was done and catching my breath. "Yes, sir." I nodded, jumping a bit when Jacob suddenly appeared next to me with a glass of tea. I'm not normally a tea drinker, but after what I had just gone through, I gladly accepted it from him and took a big sip of it. "Well, there's no harm in a simple mistake, though why didn't you just put a blanket over the mirror once you found it?" Creole asked me as he walked over to my reflection and poked her with his cane. I nearly choked on my tea when he asked me that. The thought had never even crossed my mind, and it was such a good idea. "I didn't think of that," I admitted to him, embarrassed over having not thought of that. What had my plan even been? Walk down the stairs blindfolded, holding a giant mirror? I felt like a dumbass. Don't worry about it, Mace. Just go and bring the mirror back here. I'll deal with our long friend here," Creole said as he rubbed his gloved hands together with giddy excitement. I nodded quickly and handed the nearly empty cup of tea over to Jacob before entering the hotel again through the voodoo shop's entrance. When I rounded the turn to where I had left the mirror standing in the hallway, I quickly shut my eyes as tightly as I could and began walking towards it, arms stretched out in an attempt to find it. I finally touched it and picked it up, carefully walking with it until I was back in the voodoo shop. I felt it being taken from me and figured it was Jacob taking it out of my hands. "You can open your eyes now, Mace," Creole greeted me with a chuckle after I had stood there with my eyes shut for a few minutes. When I opened them, I saw that the mirror was covered by a thick white sheet and that Jacob was carrying it over to Creole's office. "Where's my reflection?" I asked, seeing that she was no longer crumpled in the corner. "Oh, while you were getting the mirror, I tossed her back into the hotel. She shouldn't be too much of a bother." Creole let out one of his strange hums at this and beckoned me to follow him back to the register. "That's 4 favors done and only one last one to do until you've cleared your debt with me." Creole sat down and held up a single finger to me. "Sir, what is that mirror even for? Why would you want something like that?" I asked him, really not caring at the moment that I had only one favor left to do for him. "Call it an insurance policy, my darling Mace," he said with a grin on his face. "If I ever need a way to come back." "Why not come back as a nightmare?" he asked me with a series of low and creepy laughs. He shooed me away as he began cackling, and I was more than happy to leave him in a laughing fit. After everything I had just gone through, I wanted nothing more than to collapse into my bed and rot away. One favor left. That's all I had to do. Then I would be free. If only it had been that simple. Creole dangled that final favor over my head for a few weeks. He didn't summon me or even contact me, as if he was dragging out my final task until he truly felt like doing so. While it annoyed me, I eventually found it to be a blessing. It allowed me to process everything that had happened to me and recharge my batteries. I also did my best to avoid mirrors after my hotel ordeal with my corrupted reflection. Every time I even passed a mirror, it felt like at any moment she'd burst through the mirror and rip me into pieces. After almost 3 weeks of silence from Creole, I was sitting home alone, Having agreed to help my parents fill out their taxes while they continued to work themselves to the bone, I didn't exactly know what I was doing, but I figured that no one ever really knows what they're doing when they fill out a tax form. I was in the process of chewing the end of my eraser when our doorbell rang. Now I'm usually the type of person who never answers the door when the doorbell rings. If I don't know that you're coming over beforehand, then I ain't answering the door. But something about this doorbell felt different. And after all, I wasn't getting anywhere with my parents' tax forms, other than the feeling of dread with how badly we were faring, even with both of them working 2 jobs. So I stood up from the kitchen table and made my way over to the door. "Jacob?" I asked with surprise and a bit of shock when I saw the bellboy standing at my door. He waved to me happily and then reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope, handing it to me. I took it from him and was greeted by the familiar handwriting that Creole's notes carried. "Why didn't he just call me?" I asked Jacob, forgetting that Creole's bellboy was now a mute. He simply pointed at the envelope. I looked down at it, opened it, and began to read. "Mace! So sorry that I'm not able to call you. I'm currently out of town on a business trip, but this is the perfect opportunity for your final favor. Jacob is here to lead you to the shop where I've left further instructions. And don't worry about anyone seeing y'all. Not like anyone will believe you if you told them. Best regards, Casey." That last sentence felt like a threat. It was something that existed constantly in the back of my mind, especially after I found out that Creole had the police in his pocket. It was best to just grit my teeth, get this final favor done, and never have to think of old King Creole's half-priced voodoo store ever again. "Just give me a minute to get my things," I told Jacob. He nodded quickly and gave me a thumbs up. He was such a different person now that it was scary. I hadn't known Jacob well in high school, but seeing him like this caused me to feel sorry for him. He certainly didn't deserve this. It wasn't his fault that I had gotten stabbed by one of his customers. And yet it was my fault that he was now a servant of the same monster that held my own life in his gloved hands. I allowed Jacob into the house while I headed upstairs, followed by the thoughts that filled me with guilt over what had happened to him. I applied more of Creole's ointment so that my scar and stitches would continue to be hidden. I gathered my lockpicking tools and my pepper spray and finally joined Jacob downstairs. He was busy looking at the pictures hung up on my wall, and when he noticed me, he quickly spun on his heels and gave me a salute, a cheery smile on his stitched-up mouth. "Let's just get this over with," I told him. Barely able to stand his overly cheery demeanor, he nodded and followed me outside. I locked the door and followed him as he led me toward the voodoo store. As I followed Jacob, I took the letter he had given me and started reading it again. Something was bothering me. Where the hell does he need to go to be on a business trip? I asked Jacob, again as if the mute bellboy could answer me. He shrugged his shoulders as he continued down the sidewalk. I looked back down at the letter and suddenly got a terrible feeling about something. Were there other freaks like Creole? If one freak exists, it only makes sense that others also exist. This horrible line of thought was abruptly halted when I walked into Jacob. I was about to get pissed at him, but then I realized that we'd arrived at the voodoo shop. "Oh," I said, my cheeks getting warm with embarrassment. I had been so absorbed in my thoughts that we'd arrived in record time. Jacob just smiled and opened the door for me. I mouthed a quick thanks and entered the shop, hoping to leave my embarrassment outside. Every voodoo doll quickly turned to look at me as soon as I entered. I quickly held my hands up to show them that it was me, and Jacob entering the store behind me put them all at ease. I guessed that they were some sort of security system for when their boss was away. Jacob led me to Creole's office, and as we passed the basement door, whatever was down there quickly began pounding at the door. It surprised me so badly that I screamed and quickly rushed past Jacob toward the office, putting as much distance as I could from the creature in the basement. I entered Creole's office and quickly sat myself down on the comfy chair where I had received my life-saving surgery from Creole. Jacob followed after me and closed the door behind us. He went behind Creole's desk and began searching for something. I meanwhile finally took full notice of Creole's office. Since the last time I had been there, I had been on death's door. His office was filled with photos, with a grand majority of them being scratched out in some way, all except one on his desk. I reached out and grabbed the picture frame to look at it. It was an old black and white photo of a man and a woman. Is that... I held the photo closer to my eyes to examine it. The man was tall with messy black hair. Creole, I whispered to myself as the figure in the picture was a dead ringer for Creole. Of course, minus the button eyes and stitches across his mouth and neck. Just as I was about to examine the woman, the photo was suddenly snatched from my hands. I just about had a heart attack thinking that Creole had somehow returned and taken it from me. But it was only Jacob with more of my directions. Right. Sorry, I told him as I accepted the couple of pieces of paper he handed to me. There were Creole's usual doodles of what I had to retrieve, though these were the strangest ones yet. Though thinking back now, it certainly seemed hard to top a clock that caused you to decay and a mirror that creates a horror version of yourself. Creole wanted me to steal some sort of file and a porcelain doll. The porcelain doll made sense. The wall of voodoo dolls was enough to prove Creole's obsession with dolls. But the file was what interested me more. What exactly did he want that for? Was it some sort of haunted file or something? I looked at the next page, which was another letter. Why he couldn't have just told me everything in the first letter was lost to me. Mace! By now, Jacob should have given you the target of my current desire. After you've finished reading this and are ready to begin your final favor, he'll take you to your target. And I'm sure you're dying to know where it is. It's in a lovely Massachusetts mansion. The owner rarely ever goes there anymore, so it should be a walk in the park for you. Just this last favor, and you can finally go free. He didn't bother signing this one, but I could care less. The third paper appeared to be completely blank, so I just shoved that into my pocket with everything else. Well, I guess I'm ready, I told Jacob as I stood up. He nodded and reached into his pocket. He rummaged around in there for a moment before he pulled out a key. The bow of it was a skull, which probably meant that it was a skeleton key of some sort. I'm sure Creole had gotten a kick out of it for that reason. The bellboy inserted the key into Creole's office door and turned it. Before my eyes and Jacob's buttons, the door began to morph and change into a much more ornate and fancier one. The golden initials CS were stamped onto each door, and Jacob swung the door open for me. Wish me luck, I said as he handed the key to me. I assumed so I could make a quick escape if the situation called for it. He held a thumbs up and waved goodbye to me as I stepped through the doors. I had to blink my eyes furiously after entering the mansion as I was blasted, with natural lighting that blinded me when compared to the dimly lit voodoo shop. This place was massive, from a giant chandelier above my head to massive windows that let in plenty of sunlight into the mansion. But even despite its grandeur, it felt cold, both in temperature and in feeling. It was the beginning of fall, but even so, there wasn't any reason for it to be this cold. Cold enough to see my breath. I shivered as I took my few steps forward into the mansion. Right at the entrance next to the grand staircase was a giant family portrait of who I at first assumed were the owners of this massive palace. But judging by the clothes the woman was wearing and the style of suit the older man was wearing, I quickly judged that they must be some kind of ancestors. The woman and man both had their hands on the boy in front of them. The mother and I assumed her son both had blonde hair, while the father had thick brown hair with a giant mustache. Where would this file be? I wondered to myself after a moment of staring at the giant portrait. I reached into my pocket to try and find something in Creole's notes. And to my surprise, the previously blank sheet of paper had suddenly transformed into a map of the mansion. To my surprise, the file wasn't located upstairs, but in a downstairs office. Armed with this knowledge, I started making my way towards it, checking the map every so often so that I wouldn't become lost in the maze of hallways and rooms that this mansion possessed. The cold started getting to me as I shivered uncontrollably and vapors of breath poured from my mouth. The quicker I got this over with, the better. Not only as my final favor, but because I wasn't about to have myself catch a cold over this. Finally, I made it to the correct door. I tried to turn the knob and found it locked. I half expected this to just be a snatch and go, but I suppose that there was a reason Creole sent me, getting on my knees and warming up my hands with my breath. I quickly went about trying to pick this lock. What immediately struck me was how old this lock was. Not like rusty and about to fall apart old, but in design old. I'd never come across a lock like this, and I had to figure out how to actually go about picking it. My shaking hands and body also added to my struggles, and I dropped my tools on more than one occasion. Finally, after 10 minutes of fumbling, cursing, and giving up once, I finally managed to open the door. "Let's fucking go!" I shouted in excitement, covering my mouth quickly as my voice echoed throughout the mansion. I quickly entered the room and closed the door behind me. I was surprised to see that it wasn't an office, but more like a storage room with a few boxes and filing cabinets. He really wasn't going to make this easy on me, was he? I opened a few of the filing cabinets and found many of them empty, which sped up the process of finding the file I needed. It was the second to last one that finally yielded results. The only problem was that this cabinet was full of files. Just as I was about to try and steal all of them, one of them caught my eye. I was flipping through them and cursing Creole with every file that I flicked past when one felt different from the others. Mostly because it had a paperclip attached to it and a photo. I pulled this file out and looked down at it. The picture was of a woman who looked exactly like the woman at the entrance of the mansion. Opening it, I read through it a little. Abigail A. Sinclair fell into deep and uncontrollable hysteria after the death of her husband, Cornelius A. Sinclair, and the return of her son from the war. Her son has seen fit to place her under the care of the Boston Psychopathic Hospital. Her son has requested that he not be informed of her progress or if she passes away in our care. "Geez," I said as I flipped through more of the file. The most striking were two photos. One was of Abigail when she was mentally well, and the next was her locked in a straitjacket and completely a shell of her former elegant self. Her hair was wild, and her face was twisted into a look of intense fear and sorrow. I reached into my pocket to consult my magic pages, and found that the map had now turned into a simple phrase. "That one," was all it said now. I looked back down at the file and stared at the haunting eyes of Abigail. I felt horrible for her, and I could only wonder what Creole wanted this for, but it was better for me not to think about that. I closed the file and tucked it under my armpit. The paper now changed back to a map and was leading me back towards the main entrance. Walking down the hallways was quicker now that I had an idea of where I was going, and I was back at the main entrance in no time. The paper now told me to head up the grand staircase upstairs into one of the bedrooms. I assumed to Abigail's room, since judging by her file and the massive portrait, she didn't have a daughter. So I started making my way up the stairs, each of my footsteps echoing throughout the halls. At the top of the stairs, I was greeted by a different portrait, one of a tired-looking man in a suit. He had deep bags under his eyes and perfectly combed blonde hair. "This must be the son," I said as I approached the portrait. His scowl was enough to send a chill up my spine. It felt like his angry hazel eyes were staring deep into my soul. I shivered hard and quickly moved past the portrait. I reached Abigail's room and was happy to see that it was open. The room was pristine and perfect in every way. It felt like it had been deliberately kept this way, and I was intruding on a museum piece. There, sitting on the bed, was the doll, a small little porcelain one. I was going to have to be careful lest I end up accidentally dropping and shattering it. I walked to the bed and carefully picked her up. All I had to do now was make it back to the office, and I would never have to deal with shit like this ever again. I exited the bedroom and headed towards the stairs, passing the portrait of the son. Just as I did, I was suddenly and violently grabbed by the throat. In my surprise and shock at being suddenly attacked, I dropped everything I was holding to grip the mystery hand that was choking me. I watched in terror as the porcelain doll began to fall to the floor. Instead of shattering into a million pieces, though it was caught in mid-air by something. "May I ask what you're doing here?" a deep voice asked me. I looked up toward the portrait and stared at it as it seemed to come to life. The son stepped right out of the portrait and continued his death hold on me while the doll floated up next to him. I don't exactly know how he expected me to answer him, but he gave me an opportunity after he dropped me to the floor. "What?" I gasped, as I tried to suck in air, only to be met with a skeletal, goopy form staring at me from the floor. I let out a croak that was supposed to be a scream before falling backward and almost falling down the giant staircase. "That freak sent you here, didn't he?" the man asked as he looked down at me on the floor. The strange, goopy creature slithered around him like some kind of snake before perching itself on his shoulder and letting out strange gurgles from its bright white mouth. Two beady white eyes stared down at me, along with the exhausted eyes of the man who had just stepped out of a painting. "Qui Creole?" I asked him, standing up and reaching into my pocket, rubbing my thumb across my pepper spray. I didn't know if it would do anything to him, but I needed some sort of protection, and this was all I had in that department. "Yes, that bastard," he said as he took the file from the creature as it lifted it towards him. He took it, and the moment his eyes saw the picture of his mother, I could tell he wanted to kill me right there. Why the fuck would he want this? He asked me, his creature slithering over to me and opening its giant white maw. "I don't know. He just told me to get these things," I told the son, quickly holding my hand up and uncapping my pepper spray. The creature stopped just before it could eat me, and then quickly slithered back over to its master. I lowered my hand and watched as the creature morphed into the shape of his shadow, sending a woman to do his dirty work. I knew he was pathetic, but not this pathetic. He hissed, and I could immediately tell that he saw me as less than a parasite. His tired eyes were burning with rage as stared at me. I figured he was trying to figure out what to do to me, and I wasn't going to let him think that over. I pulled my pepper spray out and quickly sprayed him with it. That caught him off guard, and he let out a pained shout, quickly covering his eyes with his arm. That summoned his creature back from his shadow. In fact, as I saw him emerge once again, it was obvious that the thing was his shadow. I had gotten the spray's fumes in my own eyes, and they began to sting, and tears started streaming from them. I took this opportunity to sprint down the stairs. It's some miracle that I didn't fall and break my shit. I made it to the main entrance and quickly fished in my pocket for the skeleton key. I shoved it into the keyhole and turned it. I watched and waited for the door to finish morphing, and when it did, I flung the door open and slammed it shut behind me. I panted and sniffled as now my nose began to run uncontrollably along with the tears in my eyes. I felt a pair of hands hold my face up and suddenly cold water being poured onto my face. "Jacob?" I asked as the pain and tears began to subside. His pale, smiling face was more comforting to me than anything else could have been. I shoved my face into his bright red uniform and hugged him tightly. The floodgates opened. I don't know if it was from the pepper spray or my latest near-death experience, but I began to cry uncontrollably into Jacob's chest. He wrapped his arms around me and gave me a soft hug. "Macedonia." Creole's voice broke this brief comfort session. I looked up from Jacob's chest and whimpered softly upon seeing him there staring back at me. "I take it that it didn't go well?" Creole asked with a smile still on his face. I shook my head and gripped Jacob as if he was going to save me in some way. "I'm sorry, sir. He came out of the painting and..." "Who was that?" I asked as my thoughts ran at 1,000,000 miles an hour. Jacob produced a napkin from his pocket and offered it to me. I took it and wiped my eyes and blew my nose. "That would be a lovely associate of mine, Constantine Sinclair. He doesn't take too kindly to my antics, I'm afraid. Unfortunate that you weren't able to get those items. I would have loved to have that kind of information to hold over his stupid blonde hair." Creole sighed as he sat down behind his desk. "Where even were you?" I asked as Creole looked at me. He smiled at me and watched as Jacob continued to comfort me. He seemed to watch us for a moment as he digested the question that I had just asked him. "I was at a lovely dinner with my other associates and Sinclair. It was going just about as well as it normally does when Sinclair suddenly stood up from the table and immediately headed towards the door. "I take it you must have tripped some kind of alarm," Creole said with a laugh as he began to drum his fingers on his desk. I stared at him for a moment as I tried to figure out in my head where he could have possibly had some sort of alarm. Then I remembered the painting. Was there something about it that he could see through it? Was that how he had been able to see me inside his mansion? Jacob helped me stand back up and bowed to the two of us before leaving the office. Creole stared at me with those giant buttons for what felt like an eternity. I was sure that he was going to do something horrible to me for this second failure to complete a task for him. Well, a deal's a deal. Mace, he shrugged his shoulders as he leaned back in his chair. You're free to go. He shooed me away as he looked down at his desk. I stood there in shock. Surely it wasn't going to be this easy, was it? Just as I turned to leave, though, he stopped me. There is one more thing, though. The tone in which he said this sent a chill up my spine. He was giddy with excitement and also ominously followed by low chuckles. Your daddy came to visit me the other day. I spun on my heels quickly and stared at him. He was resting his head on his hand and smiled at me. The smile was one of superiority over me. He begged me to help with his financial situation, and I'm inclined to help him. Of course, if he doesn't think his wish over thoroughly. I'd hate to see a repeat of your friends and Jacob. He threatened me as he drummed his fingers on his desk. Stay away from my family, I warned him, even though I had nothing to back it up with. He giggled at that and stood up from his chair. Or what? You'll call the police? You'll kill me? He hummed and shook his head. How about a trade? I spare your father and your mother for good measure, and you become my permanent errand girl. His gross yellow smile sharpened into fangs as he stared at me. I clenched my fists tightly. I had no choice. He had every good card in the deck. He had a royal flush and I had a one-of-a-kind. I wanted nothing more than to rip his head off, maybe even go back and try and work for the blondie. But I was stuck here now in this moment. I want it in writing. I don't want you changing the deal, I demanded. He nodded quickly and reached behind his desk to produce a contract. Feel free to read it. He slid it across the desk toward me. I walked over to it and looked down at it. It was everything he had told me beforehand without any fine print for me to read. He offered me a pen and twirled it around his fingers as I stared at it in thought. How long for? I asked him as I took the pen from him. Until I get bored with you, he said with a smile. I stared at him and then down at the paper. I love my mom and dad more than anything in this world, including myself. So I signed the paper. I watched as my signature melted into the paper and turned into gold letters on the page. Wonderful. You're free to go home. Don't worry about Sinclair either. I'll handle him. He shooed me away as he rolled the paper up and caused it to disappear from his gloved fingers. I silently left his office in complete defeat. Jacob was waiting at the door for me and he opened it for me. Thanks, I mumbled to him as I left the shop and started my way home. This was my life now, stuck in a contract with a horrible voodoo monster with no possible way out until he got bored with me. I had no way of escaping this. All I had going for me was that for now, my family was safe. And really, at the end of the day, that's all I wanted. The conversation with my dad about King Creole was the most heated I've ever had. Just mentioning his name to my dad was enough to send him into shock. He demanded to know where I had heard that name. I had to tell him everything about what had happened to me and my friends, about how we had been breaking into places to steal valuables, and how it had all gone wrong the moment we entered the voodoo store. I can't believe this, my dad said as he buried his face into his hands and let out a shaky exhale. I didn't know what to do as I watched my dad tear up. I rubbed my arm as he began to cry into his hands. I didn't know if it was because his daughter had been reduced to robbing places to help keep us off the street, or that both of us were now under the control of a psychopathic voodoo man. I'm sorry, Dad, I said as I left him to digest the knowledge I just dumped on him. I left out the part where I had been stabbed in the neck and nearly killed. I figured he could handle only so much terrible news. His deal with Creole was for a better paying job, and he had just been called for the opportunity to enter the management of one of the only remaining manufacturing plants left in town. Then I had to come and rain on his parade. But knowing Creole, there had to be some kind of horrible strings attached to this wish granting. Nothing was ever straightforward with him, and as I pulled out the contract I signed with him, I quickly began to realize that while this document guaranteed my dad and mom's lives, it didn't guarantee mine, or for that matter, it didn't guarantee their lives if something happened to me. In my fury and panic over my dad having made a deal with Creole, I hadn't been able to think clearly. Maybe I should have hired a lawyer to help me look over this thing. While I was lamenting my lack of legal representation, as if on cue, my phone began to ring. I already knew who it was and I didn't want to answer it. But then I would have to explain to my dad who the undead bellboy was who had just shown up at our door looking for me. So begrudgingly I reached out and picked up the phone to answer it. "My marvelous Mace, could you come on over to the shop? Seems we have an issue that you need to help resolve." Creole's cheery southern voice was enough to make me want to punch a hole into my bedroom wall. I didn't even bother answering him, simply grunting in reply and hanging up on him. If he wasn't going to even be paying me for all this, he was going to get the bare minimum of effort from me. Bringing my usual items of lockpicking, a new can of pepper spray, and my phone, I applied more ointment to my invisible scar and headed downstairs. My dad was still at the kitchen table, staring forlornly at the table as I wordlessly left the house. I'm sure he could figure out where I was going, so it didn't matter if I told him or not. Walking down the street, I was again lost in my mind, thinking about how screwed I was. I was so focused I didn't even realize that a limo had pulled up alongside me, and it wasn't until some unseen force yanked me inside that I did realize that, before I had a chance to reach into my pocket for my pepper spray, it was yanked away by an unseen slimy force. I couldn't even let out a scream because that same slimy force quickly covered my mouth and filled my nostrils with a noxious and horrible odor. "I'd rather not have you pepper spray me again, woman," the familiar voice told me as my eyes adjusted to the sudden darkness inside the limo. As my eyes adjusted, the sallow face of Constantine Sinclair stared back at me with nothing but disgust in his exhausted eyes. I felt something heavy lean onto my shoulder and looked over to see the skeletal face of his shadow creature staring back at me with its pure white eyes. "I'll make this quick. The less time I spend here, the better," he said as he reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a cigar. I half expected him to pull out a gun and whack me like a mob boss or something. Instead, he calmly produced a cigar cutter and snipped the end off of his stogie. "Why were you in my mansion? More importantly, what were you doing with files concerning my mother?" he asked as he placed the cigar in his mouth. His shadow monster slithered away from me and removed its hand from my mouth. It then suddenly produced a match and lit the cigar of its master for him. "Creole sent me there to gather them. I don't exactly know why," I told him, doing my best to not gag from the double whammy of the rotting smell of the shadow and now the cigar smoke. Sinclair huffed and blew out a bluish plume of smoke into the dimly lit limo. I wanted so badly to roll down the window, but I figured that he had them child-proofed in the back. As I figured, Asshole was trying to get leverage over me, he said as he took a drag from his cigar. He wasn't focusing on me, but his shadow kept a close eye on me, its pure white eyes keeping an obsessive watch over me. "And I take it that you work for him now?" Sinclair asked after a moment more of thought. "Unfortunately," I answered. He nodded again and looked to his shadow, who suddenly got a disappointed look on its face. "What are you going to do to me?" I asked him after a moment. I thought that maybe if he didn't let me go, I could use my tools for lockpicking as some sort of weapon if he tried something. But I doubted that I could fist fight a weird, goopy shadow monster. "Nothing, for now, but if you ever set foot on my property ever again, I won't hesitate to feed you to him." His shadow unhinged its jaw and produced a gaping maw at me that sent a shiver up my spine. I wanted so badly to just be away from him and tell your boss to keep his disgusting undead hands off of my property as well. He shooed me away, and on that cue, the doors to the limo unlocked. I quickly exited the limo and put as much distance as possible between me and him. "Oh, one more thing," he said as the window rolled down. I looked back and was suddenly hit in the forehead by the can of pepper spray. I let out a pained grunt and rubbed my forehead as the limo slowly drove away. I bent over and picked up the spray and watched as his limo slowly faded into the distance. "Fucking asshole," I mumbled as I shoved the pepper spray back into my pocket and continued on my way to the voodoo shop. A part of me wished that Sinclair's shadow had eaten me, because maybe then I wouldn't have to do whatever it was that Creole was going to send me on. But I had a family to protect, so I sucked in as much air as I could and entered the store. the sad rusty bell signaling my arrival. "Mace!" Just the woman I was expecting. Creole greeted me with giddy excitement. I offered him a little wave as I approached the register. I was surprised to see that Jacob wasn't there, and it made me a little sad not to see him waiting for me there. But I did my best to hide my contempt for Creole. After all, I couldn't let him get bored of me already. "What have you got for me this time, sir?" I asked with as much enthusiasm as I could muster. Creole was ecstatic with my minimal amount of effort, and he quickly sprang up from the chair and sauntered over to me, quickly wrapping an arm over me and pulling me close to him. Clearly, he still had no concept of personal space. "Well, as it turns out, we need to clean up a mess the two of us made. Turns out that version of you that crawled out of that lil old mirror I had you get is causing some amount of issues, so I need you to go and deal with it." He framed it like it was as simple as going to the gas station and picking up some snacks or something. "How am I supposed to kill that thing? And if I kill it, will it kill me?" I asked him. Because if that was the case, I would rather have her roaming around than have the two of us dying. Excellent questions. "Mace!" "First, this is how you'll beat the creature." He reached into his suit and pulled out a small little golden bell. I stared at him in confusion. How the hell was a bell supposed to save me? He rang the bell and we both waited a moment. Then suddenly Jacob popped up from behind the register, saluting like some kind of superbly dressed soldier. "Be a good boy and bring the dagger." "Jacob, my boy," Creole told the happy bellhop, who quickly nodded and practically skipped over to us and presented a dagger to Creole. It was a simple knife in a ceramic sheath, nothing fancy about it. And if anything, it seemed like some kind of prop that a crappy high school play would use. "I have to get close to her," I asked him as I took the knife with apprehension. I unsheathed it and was greeted with a normal-looking dagger. How was this thing any better than a regular pocket knife? And for that matter, how was this going to kill that version of me? "Well, you got plenty close when you stared at the mirror. I'm sure you can deal with it, no problem," Creole said with a smile, letting me go and walking over to Jacob. "If it makes you feel better, Jacob will be going with you. If things get too bad, I'm sure he'll be of some help." Creole chuckled, walking back over to the register and sitting back down. "Well, you'll better get going. No telling what that other mace is up to. He shooed us away." I sighed as I resheathed the dagger and stuck it into my pocket. Jacob led me back over to the entrance of the voodoo store and reached into his pocket to pull out another skeleton key. Inserting it into the keyhole and turning the lock, we both stared and watched as the door warped into the shape of the hotel's main entrance. When it was done, Jacob pulled the key back out and opened the door for me. I thanked him and entered the abandoned hotel. Already within the first couple of steps, I could tell that the hotel had changed. The already pitch-black hotel had gotten even darker, and Creole had neglected to give me any source of light this time around. As I fumbled around, I stepped on something wet and squishy. I instantly had a bad feeling and quickly reached into my pocket to pull my phone out. Turning the flashlight on, I looked down at where my foot had stepped. I had stepped on what looked like intestines. Oh, fuck me. I shivered as I quickly turned my flashlight off. Something told me that the dark would be much better than knowing what else I could be stepping on. I fumbled for a bit more until I walked straight into the front desk and knocked over whatever was on it. Cursing in the dark, I was suddenly illuminated by a source of light behind me. Turning, I saw Jacob standing there with two actual flashlights in his hands. "Thanks, Jacob," I said with a tired smile. I walked over, making sure to ignore the squishy noises that came from every step I took toward him. I took the flashlight from him, and he nodded with that permanent smile he always had. Seeing the front desk, he happily skipped over to it and took his place behind it. I figured this was where he was going to stay while I went me hunting. I began making my way towards the door to the stairs, glancing at every corner with my flashlight and shuddering at the stains of blood and meat chunks strewn about everywhere. I figured that this was the issue that the mirror me was causing that needed to be dealt with. Creole probably didn't have much jurisdiction out here in Pennsylvania, so an evil, monster version of me running around and killing people probably wouldn't fly very well. As I approached the stairwell door, I took a deep breath. I knew what smell awaited me on the other side of the door. With sufficient breath to ensure that I made it up a couple of flights of stairs and away from the smell, I opened the door and shone my flashlight into the pile of corpses waiting for me at the bottom. Now, having expected them, I had a chance to examine them, and what I was met with confused me to no end. Most of the bodies were long and gangly, just like the version of me that had crawled out of the mirror. I made a mental note of that and quickly rushed up the stairs to escape the smell. Once I was far enough up the stairs, I started breathing again, only getting a slight hint of rot and decay. Every step I took toward the 11th floor echoed throughout the stairwell, and I had to take several pauses. I could have sworn that something was following me up the stairs. It was the same as the first time I had been here in the hall. It felt like there was something following me. It took me several minutes of stopping and starting to make it up the stairs to the 11th floor. In my mind, I figured that mirror me would be hanging around near where the mirror had been. And if not, I would just have to go floor by floor. Arriving at last at the 11th floor, I entered into the hallway and closed a door behind me. Happy to leave those strange echoing footsteps behind me, but now I was just in a familiar hell. I shone my light in every direction that mirror me might be in. Slowly, I started making my way through the halls, stopping every few seconds for any possible sound that may have been my target. "This sucks," I whispered to myself as I pulled out the knife and held it out in front of me. I felt like some protagonist in a shitty horror movie, and I made damn sure to check behind me every moment I got. As I neared the scene of our first chase, I saw that the damage that Mirror Me had done was still there, meaning that I didn't have to go room by room looking for her. She'd have most likely broken into any room, so that was a silver lining. A microscopic one, but it was one. I shone my light into the room where the mirror had been and waited to see if there would be a reaction. There wasn't one, so I took a deep breath and stuck my head into the room. Satisfied that she wasn't in there, I turned to continue down the hallway. That was until I heard something, like nails scraping across metal. I flashed my light in several directions in an attempt to figure out where it was coming from, but to no avail. But this wasn't like the steps. They didn't stop after a while. They continued. I started walking again, and the sound continued to follow me. It sounded like it was right on top of me, and that gave me the idea. I slowly turned my light to the ceiling, and staring back at me were the crazed eyes of my mirror version. I let out a surprised scream at seeing her hanging from the ceiling. She was crawling like some sort of bug on the ceiling with her nails dug into the roof. Her head completely rotated around like a fucking owl to stare at me. And upon making eye contact with her, she grinned at me with eyes that screamed murder. Her mouth was coated in dried blood, and I could already tell what she wanted to do to me. I wasted no time after discovering her than booking it towards the nearest room. She let out a haunting laugh, which turned into a screech as she began chasing after me. There was going to be no time for me to pick any of the locks, so my best bet was heading towards one of the rooms that she had already broken into. And to my luck, past the turn in the hallway was one of those rooms. I ran inside and quickly ran into the bathroom, slamming the door closed and locking it. She had been closer than I would have liked as she slammed into the door just as I locked it. Great. Now I'm trapped. I scolded myself. But in my defense, a life or death situation calls for quick thinking, and this was as quick as I could think. I shone my light around every inch of the bathroom to look for something to fight back with. A knife was nice, but I needed something to keep her at bay as well. Unless she was allergic to soap or towels, there wasn't much in here that could get her off my back long enough to use this knife. Then I noticed the toilet. Quickly I grabbed the lid off the back tank and waited for her to break through the door. She was relentless as she continued to bash her head against the door, and it began to break and splinter. I backed up and stood on top of the toilet and readied like a baseball player ready to strike her the moment she busted into the bathroom. Finally, the door split down the middle and she lunged into the bathroom. I swung as hard as I could at her. The lid shattered against her and she went flying into the bathtub. The shower curtain fell on her and quickly entangled her as she flailed around in confusion. I took my chance and quickly climbed on top of her and plunged the dagger into her. But to my shock, the shower curtain had bunched up just enough to dampen my stab, so that it barely so much as nicked her. She quickly let out a scream and kicked me off of her. sending me right into the bathroom mirror and causing it to shatter, just what I needed. 7 more years of bad luck. I let out a grunt and stared at the mirror me as she rose from the bathtub and the curtain fell off of her. She was so much more taller than me, and she reached out to grab me by the head. "You're mine," she hissed at me, in a voice that sounded like me if I'd been smoking for the entirety of my life. She opened her mouth and leaned in to take a bite out of me. She had been so focused on eating me, however, that she hadn't noticed me grabbing a shard of mirror and sticking her in the neck with it. She screamed again and dropped me, yanking the shard of glass out of her neck and attempting to stop the flow of blood. I fell to the ground in a thud and quickly started searching for the knife in all the chaos that was the bathroom floor. Finally, I found it, and instead of taking my chances, I quickly put more distance between me and her. She was still busy dealing with her bleeding neck, but upon seeing me starting to escape, she quickly ignored it and got back on all fours, ready to chase me. I quickly looked around for something else to defend myself with and landed on one of those old fat TVs. I rushed towards it and picked it up as best as I could. Grunting with how heavy it was, I quickly tossed it at her as she came running out of the bathroom. It hit her with a loud crash, and I quickly jumped on her again once she was dazed. This time for sure, I plunged the knife into her back and drove it to the hilt. She let out a pained and gurgle-filled scream, and before my eyes, she began to wither away. But before she completely did, her head spun around and she bent backward at almost a 90-degree angle and sank her teeth into my skull. At a sideways bite, she yanked out my left eye and chunks of bone and flesh along with it as she shriveled up and died like a spider. I let out a pained scream and staggered backward before collapsing and screaming more in pain. The pain was so bad that I must have blacked out, because before I knew it, I had woken up in a different room in the hotel, one that happened to have power and was lit up. Jacob was sitting on the bed and gave me a little wave. I was so thankful to see him that I sat up in bed almost immediately. "Is she dead?" I croaked. My mouth felt like I had just eaten a handful of sand. Jacob nodded and quickly reached over to the nightstand next to my bed and offered me a glass of water. I quickly guzzled it down and let out a satisfied sigh. I then reached up towards the glaring lack of vision in my left eye, but before I could touch it, Jacob quickly grabbed my hand and shook his head. "It's better if you don't touch it. Quite the nasty bite." Creole's voice came from the bathroom as the tall voodoo man emerged from inside with a smile that threatened to rip all his stitches. "Seems that mirror creature got the last bite off on you," he chuckled as he shooed Jacob off of the bed. "Nice to see you too, sir." I huffed as he carefully held my face in his gloved hands and examined the wound that Mirror Me had given me. He didn't give off any indication of how bad it was, but considering I couldn't see what he was doing on my left side, it was safe to say that my eye was well and truly fucked. "Well, we have some options for you. Marvelous, Mace," Creole said as he let go of my face and patted my head. "I can give you a button eye." He smiled and tapped his own. "Or a glass eye," he offered, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the 2 options he had presented me. "You can't just fix my regular eye?" I asked him as I quickly took the glass one. I wasn't about to end up looking like him or Jacob if I could help it. Creole looked over at Jacob and then back at me. Well, if I still had the other eye, it might be possible. Unfortunately, it seems that it was crushed in the creature's jaw when it clamped down on you. He shrugged and took the glass eye from me, rubbing it around in his gloved hands and presenting it to me, with a slight purple glow emanating from it. "But you'll be able to see just fine with this one. Satisfaction guaranteed," he said with that usual big stupid smile on his face. I took the eye from him and looked down at it. I stood up from the bed and went into the bathroom, and I had to stop myself from screaming at the reflection I saw staring back at me. My left eye was gone and parts of my skull were visible. I fell to the floor and began crying uncontrollably from my remaining eye. As I lay there on the bathroom floor, I felt arms wrap around me and pull me into a hug. I looked up and was greeted by Jacob's smiling form looking down at me. I buried my face in his chest and cried my eye out. After I sufficiently calmed down, Creole helped me put my new eye into its home. Vision quickly returned to it, and I looked around to make sure it was working correctly. I was still a sniffling mess, and Jacob handed me tissues to wipe my nose.
Well, that should do it.
The ointment I gave you for your scar will also work on the area around your eye. Now, I'll leave you two to finish up here. Can't leave the shop unattended for too long after all. He giggled happily as he exited the room and left me alone with Jacob. I looked over at him and then reached for the notepad and pen that were on the nightstand next to my bed. He looked at them and then at me with a quizzical look. "Can you please help me escape him?" I asked him and handed him the notepad. He took it and looked at it for a minute as if he was trying to remember how to write. Then he scratched it with the pen a few times before presenting it to me. It was a smiley face. I caught so off guard that I couldn't help but snort and laugh, both at my hopeless situation and at his response. Seemed that in the process of creating him, Creole had scooped out his brains. I was on my own, and this was the second time that I had almost been killed working for Creole. Who knows when the time will come that I'm finally killed off. Home didn't feel the same after I returned from the hotel. My dad knew that I knew how he'd gotten that high-paying job, and he knew what I had been doing to help us make ends meet before getting entangled with Creole. It got even worse when one day he walked in on me as I was applying the ointment to cover my scars. That broke him. He started crying uncontrollably upon seeing me with the deep scar on my neck and my missing eye surrounded by my skull. It was the first time I'd seen my dad cry like that, and I couldn't do anything to console or help him, because I knew if I did, I would start crying and wouldn't be able to stop. We were both at rock bottom, with my mom trying in vain to figure out why we were so upset. Creole must have known what I was going through and allowed it to continue. For an entire month, he didn't call on me for anything, and that worried me more than if he did, because there was always the looming and constant fear that he would get bored with me. And him being bored with me probably meant my immediate death. It was a relief when I was home alone again that I received a knock at the door. I looked down at my phone to make sure that I still had plenty of time since my last ointment appointment. Satisfied that I had plenty of time, I stood up and answered the door. Seeing that smiling face and red uniform instantly brightened my day a little. "Hey Jacob, what's he got for me this time?" I asked him as the forever smiling bellhop stared at me with his button eyes. He happily presented me with an envelope and gave me a little salute at completing his mission. I took the envelope and opened it up, sighing when I saw the all-too-familiar handwriting. "Marvelous, Ms.
Mace!
It would seem that I require your skills in another endeavor. Jacob shall escort you to the store. And do make sure to bring all your tools. Casey." I heavily exhaled through my nose and invited Jacob into the house so I could gather my things. I quickly ran upstairs and rounded up my lockpicking tools, pepper spray, and this time a pocket knife as well. I'd gotten myself one after the ordeal of the hotel. Just as I was applying more ointment and resetting my timer, I heard the front door open and a bunch of grocery bags rustling. My heart instantly dropped. My mom had gotten back earlier than expected. I quickly finished putting the ointment on and ran downstairs as quickly as I could. I nearly ran into my mom as she was hanging one of the bags on the stair railings. "Jesus, Maria, Jose, Macedonia," my mom shouted in surprise. I half expected it to be because of Jacob, but a glance around the first floor revealed that he wasn't anywhere in sight. "You nearly gave me a heart attack," my mom sighed, fanning herself dramatically. "Sorry, Mom," I apologized, wrapping my arms around her and squeezing her. "I'm going out." "Okay," I told her. She looked at me judgmentally, mostly at what I was wearing before wishing me good luck and the usual million things to be careful of. I nodded at all of them and parted with a kiss on her cheek. As I exited the front door, it was my turn to nearly have a heart attack as Jacob surprised me by poking his head out of the bush next to the front door. "How'd you get in there?" I silently shouted at him. He pointed at the open window just above the bush, and I couldn't help but snort and giggle at the thought of him diving out of the window into the bush once my mom had arrived back at the house. I helped him to get out of the bush and brushed the leaves off of his uniform. We started making our way towards the voodoo shop, all the while my mind continued to wander in various scenarios in which my situation was going to end. Most of them with me and my entire family dead or turned into voodoo dolls. "Jacob!" An unknown voice broke my endless doom loop. I looked up and Jacob and I stared at a sketchy dude across the street from us, who quickly ran over and grabbed Jacob by his gold-trimmed collar. "Where the fuck have you been, man? I've been trying to call you for months." He shouted at Jacob, who just stared at him with his permanent smile and tilted his head in confusion. "Leave him alone. We're trying to be somewhere, asshole," I told the guy, grabbing Jacob by the arm and starting to tug on it. The guy looked at me like I was literal shit on his shoe and stared back at Jacob. "Who the fuck is she? More importantly, why the fuck are you dressed like this? It isn't Halloween, you freak," he shouted at Jacob. He continued on about how he hadn't made a single delivery in months and that some scary people were looking for him. Jacob continued to stare blankly at this guy before turning to me and taking his hat off. "Hey, asshole,
Don't ignore me!
he shouted at Jacob as he placed the hat on me. I stared at him in confusion before he lifted his hands to cover his button eyes. He then lowered his hands and pointed at me. It took me a few seconds to figure out he wanted me to cover my eyes. So I hesitated for a moment before lifting my hands and covering my eyes. As I covered my eyes, I heard the guy let out a choked scream before a sickening crunch and tearing overpowered the sounds of his muted screams. I shut my eyes as tightly as I could and suddenly wondered something. My glass eyes didn't have an eyelid, so how exactly was it shut right at that moment? Did it turn off on command? I didn't have long to wonder at the logistics as I felt Jacob's hat being taken off of me. I lowered my hands and was met by Jacob's usual smiling face, and not a single stain on his uniform at all. I looked at him and then around us in confusion. There wasn't a single sight of the asshole, not a body part, not a drop of blood, not even a scrap of clothing. Absolutely nothing. I knew better than to inquire about what had happened, so I simply continued our walk towards the voodoo store.
Mace!
"It's been so long. How's the eye treating you?" Creole asked me. Giddy with excitement upon seeing me, I was instantly reminded how much I hated him. His stupid smile and his constant giddiness, it irked and annoyed me. "It's fine, sir," I told him as dryly as I could. As usual, that didn't register at all to him, and he simply nodded and looked over at Jacob. "I see you two came upon some trouble, but Jacob handled it, so no harm done," Creole said with a smile and walked over to the register. I followed after him and watched as he picked up the template doll from the register and started tossing it up and down in the air. "What's the problem this time?" I asked him, stuffing my hands into my jacket pocket. He stared at me for a moment with that toothy yellow grin for a few moments before letting some giggles rise up from his throat. I could already tell that this was going to suck. Seems that while I was away, a rat got into some of my potions, made quite the mess of the shop. You should have seen it. Now that little old rat has run off and made a nest in the high school. I'm gonna need you to deal with it for me. He smiled as he caught the template doll in mid-air and gave it a hard squeeze in between his gloved fingers. "No," I told him. That got his attention. He raised a brow at me and tossed the doll onto the register table. "I can't," I said as I felt my heart beating out of control. Since I was a little girl, I had an absolute phobia of rats. Everything about them disgusted me and freaked me out. And now I had to go and kill some probably giant monster rat. "Oh, Mace, we both know you ain't in a position of refusing me." Creole extended his hand out to me and the contract that I signed with him. He was right. I had no right to refuse him. But at the same time, I'd rather have him kill me than have to face a giant rat, not to mention if it had gotten into his potions. There was no telling what that thing had turned into. "Can't you have the cops handle it?" I asked, still trying to find a way out of it. Creole slammed his fist down on the hard wooden table, and I swear it felt like the entire shop would come crumbling down in top of us. "You'll be doing it. Understand? I don't want to have to visit your parents any sooner than I have to. Macedonia," he told me in a low and gravely voice. His yellow teeth sharpened into fangs, and I quickly looked down at the floor, and finally nodded after a few moments of trying to think of a way out of it. "Yes, sir," I told him submissively. "Splendid. Jacob will be coming with you. Naturally. You two seem to make a good team." His mood shifted instantly once I became cooperative. His usual bubbly and happy personality returned. I simply nodded and looked over at Jacob. He kept up his permanent smile and gave me a little wave. I returned it with a half-hearted smile of my own. "Well off with the two of you then. The sooner you deal with that rat, the sooner you can go home again," Creole said with a smile as he dismissively waved the two of us away, and without giving me any other way of protecting myself from whatever monster rat he'd accidentally created. I sighed as I followed after Jacob as he fished out the magic skeleton key and inserted it into the voodoo shop's door. I watched as the door contorted and warped into one of the high school's main doors. I grabbed the metal handle before Jacob could and pushed it open. Being inside the darkened school was like having one of those nightmares where you're back in school again, or when you come to school after hours and the entire building is eerily quiet. "Let's just get this over with," I mumbled to Jacob as we started making our way towards the cafeteria. If a giant rat was going to be anywhere, it'd probably be there. We passed several photos of past classes and clubs, and I came to a stop at the photo I had managed to get into. I'd snuck into cheer practice with Jess, who had been a cheerleader and had gotten my picture taken with the whole squad. It brought me back to simpler times and was a cruel reminder of what had happened to my friends. I looked over at Jacob and noticed that his button eyes were trained squarely on a photo. I walked over to him and noticed he was looking at a picture of the video game club, and staring straight at me with a happy and toothy grin was the old Jacob. Before dropping out and becoming a drug dealer, before becoming an undead bellhop. Jacob kept staring at the photo for a few more seconds before turning to look at me. There was no indication on his permanently closed and stitched smile that he felt any different, but something felt off about him. As I was about to ask him what the matter was, but a loud crash and rattling came from the direction of the cafeteria. I instantly shoved my face into Jacob's chest in absolute terror. He wrapped his arms around me and gave me a hard squeeze. I don't know what it is about Jacob that gives me such a calming response whenever I'm near him. Whatever it is, it was powerful enough to give me my strength back as I quickly dug into my pockets and pulled out the can of pepper spray and my pocket knife. "Okay, I can do this, right?" I looked back at Jacob for confirmation. He gave me 2 thumbs up, and we continued on course toward the cafeteria. Finding the doors locked, I quickly handed my items to Jacob and got on my knees to begin picking the lock. It was second nature to me at this point. There had been plenty of times during high school where I had broken into the cafeteria to steal some food or a snack. In just a few swift flicks of the pins and tumblers, the door swung open. Jacob went first before motioning for me to follow after him. It certainly seemed like the rat had been here, judging by the simple fact that the tables and benches were strewn and thrown in every possible direction. In the direction of the kitchen, the whole metal screen separating the kitchen from the cafeteria was broken and bent in various directions. I was suddenly realizing that I was probably going to be fighting a bear-sized rat with only a knife and some pepper spray. "I don't hear it," I whispered to Jacob as the two of us began approaching the kitchen. We poked our heads into the utter devastation that had happened to the kitchen. Appliances were ripped from the wall. The freezer door had been ripped from its hinges, and the remains of dozens of frozen lunches were strewn about in every possible direction. I picked up a frozen round pizza and said a silent prayer for the only decent thing the school ever gave to me. Despite all the destruction, however, there was no sign of the rat. I suddenly became afraid that the thing could turn invisible. It was then that I noticed that Jacob was staring up at the ceiling. I quickly dropped the pizza and followed his gaze upward, terrified that the rat was hanging from the ceiling like the mirror version of me had done. But instead, I was greeted by a giant gaping hole in the ceiling. "Well, it isn't here. Where the hell else could it be?" I asked Jacob, who looked back at me and shrugged. I groaned and started looking around at the floor, trying to think of where it could be. I stared too long at the floor, though, as my new glass eye just popped out of my head and fell to the floor. "Oh, fuck off." I hissed in anger as I quickly dropped to my knees and began scrambling after it. I managed to catch it just before it rolled under the stove and cleaned it as best as I could before inserting it back into my skull. As I was letting the magic item return vision to my left side, I stared at the stove for a moment before a thought crossed my mind. What about the home econ room? They have a cooking class there. I quickly stood up and Jacob quickly nodded. The only problem was that the home econ room was on the other side of the school from where we were. Plenty of chances for the rat to ambush us. So as we started walking down the halls towards the home econ room, I made sure to hold on to Jacob's hand. Our high school isn't even that big, and yet the walk from the cafeteria felt like it took 60 years. Mostly because every single noise caused me to stop and wait to see what was going to pop out and attack me. By the time we entered the area where the home econ room was, I was able to hear something rummaging around and destroying things in the classroom. It seemed that my hunch had paid off. The only problem was that I was too scared to move even a muscle. I looked back at Jacob and he gave me a thumbs up. I squeezed his hand tightly and nodded back at him, letting go of his hand and fishing my can of pepper spray out of my jacket pocket. I glanced into the classroom through the window. Besides the absolute devastation of the classroom, I watched in horror as a giant rat's tail was dragged along the floor like some enormous worm. I quickly shook my head and turned to Jacob. I can't do it. I whimpered at him, feeling the onset of a panic attack incoming. Jacob rubbed my arms and waited for me to slightly calm down. I did my best to get a hold of myself and again peeked into the window of the destroyed kitchen room. I got a good look at the giant rat as it broke into one of the stoves. Most of its fur had fallen off in giant patches, and giant spikes were piercing out of its back. As it turned its head to toss the stove away from the wall, I could see that one of its eyes was missing. I breathed a sigh of relief. It was blind in that eye, just like I was. I took a deep breath and carefully tried to open the door, but the handle only jiggled a little. It was locked. That slight movement of the door triggered the rat. As it quickly whipped its head towards the door, my eye met its eyes, as it still had its right eye along with a giant cluster of eyes above and below it. Shit, I mumbled as it let out a loud screech and proceeded to charge towards the door. I felt Jacob quickly grab me and shove me away just as the giant rat busted down the door on top of him. I landed on the floor on my ass and watched as Jacob struggled to keep the rat from bringing its full weight on top of him and squishing him into a puddle. Hey, shithead! I screamed at the rat, getting its attention. I aimed my pepper spray at it and pressed down, spraying it in its giant cluster of eyes. It let out a pained shriek and fell over as it tried in vain to get the stinging chemical spray out of its eyes. I quickly dropped the empty can and winced as the stinging began to form in my good eye. One good thing about having a magic glass eyeball is that it isn't affected by pepper spray, so I at least had one advantage over the rat. At least I thought I did, as a deep rumbling noise came from deep inside the rat. I took a step back as I held my knife out in front of me as if it was some kind of sword or spear. I watched in disgust as a new cluster of eyes spawned from the empty eye socket, and before I could process that, the rat pounced on me and pinned me to the floor. I thrashed and kicked trying to get it off of me, and even began stabbing it in the neck. It screamed and began rumbling again as long, slender tentacles began to spawn from its back and began thrashing around like whips. Oh, you gotta be fucking kidding! I screamed as I began stabbing it in the face and the eyes, any spot that could get it off of me, doing my best to avoid its mouth, which was constantly snapping and gnashing at me. One of my stabs ended up landing underneath the rat's snout and I was too careless. The knife became stuck inside him, and I tried to use my left hand to give me more leverage to pull it out. In doing so, I got too close to its mouth and it clamped down on my hand. I screamed my fucking lungs out, and on instinct yanked my hands out of its mouth and watched as my pinky, ring finger, and half of my middle finger remained in the rat's mouth. I let go of the knife and clutched my bloody hand with my other. The rat eagerly chewed on my fingers and was about to come back for more when Jacob slammed a metal desk chair against its head. It stumbled and looked over at him, just in time for Jacob to bring it down on the rat's head. It screeched and quickly began scurrying away. Instead of chasing after it, Jacob quickly dropped to his knees and began taking care of me. "We gotta get out of here," before it comes back. I whimpered, staring as a fountain of blood came pouring out of my damaged hand. Jacob quickly ripped off his sleeve and made a tourniquet and a bandage for me out of it. I couldn't really stain it since it was the same color as my blood. Jacob quickly picked me up bridal style and ran towards the stairwell entrance, just as I heard the rat coming back for another attack. We entered the stairwell, and Jacob quickly rushed us upstairs, just as the rat crashed through the door. We made it upstairs and found ourselves in the science wing of the school. Jacob quickly ducked us into a classroom that happened to be open and quickly closed and locked the door, pushing a chair up against the door as well. We both ducked down as we heard the rat running past us on a wild goose chase to find us. I whimpered and winced at the pain stinging from my hand. It was then that a terrifying thought entered my mind. I wouldn't be able to pick locks with a hand like this, at least until I could get used to only having 2.5 fingers. Would Creole get bored of me if I couldn't pick locks anymore? I looked around the classroom and suddenly was struck with a familiar feeling, like I'd been here before. I looked over toward the teacher's desk and was flushed with memories of the only science class I'd ever enjoyed and passed with a grade higher than a C. Mr. Picot's chemistry class. Jacob. I have an idea. I winced as I stood up and quickly whispered to my smiling savior. He quickly came over and got on his knees as I wobbly sat up on mine. In that cabinet, I pointed towards a big metal cabinet. Mr. Picot keeps some dry ice in a thermal cooler. We can make dry ice bombs to fight that thing, I told him. Jacob quickly nodded as he agreed to my plan. He helped me stand up on my feet and the two of us walked over to the cabinet. I dug into my pocket and pulled out the tools. Jacob helped me as he held the left hook pick steady for me as I used my good hand to fiddle around. I was lucky that Mr. Picot used a pretty cheap lock for the cabinet. After only 2 failed attempts, we got the locker opened. Jacob quickly opened the cooler and pulled out the small block of dry ice from its container. I went under Mr. Picot's desk and quickly grabbed a couple of mini water bottles that he always had on hand in case someone needed some water during a test. Jacob carefully drained each bottle so only a little bit of water was left and cut the dry ice into little chunks, wrapping them up in a paper towel and adding them to the water bottle. I was impressed at how skillfully he was doing this. I'd always imagined Jacob as the typical school-hating wannabe gangster, but here he was proving that he knew what he was doing. The water would stop an immediate release of the CO2 into the bottle and give us time to chuck it at the rat. Our best bet was going to be getting it to swallow one. So with our arsenal of 6 bombs made, and carefully being carried by Jacob in a lost and found backpack we'd found in the classroom, we exited the classroom and started making as much noise as possible, banging our hands against the lockers and me screaming as loudly as I could. Soon enough, we heard the loud scurrying running towards us again. It had changed again, with its mouth having split open like a flower full of teeth and bleeding gums. If I didn't walk away from this completely traumatized of rats, I was going to be very surprised. Jacob reached into the back and pulled out a bomb, giving it a good shake before tossing it. Unfortunately for us, it blew up mid-air and sent a loud bang throughout the school. That didn't seem to bother the rat as it kept charging towards us. I quickly took a bottle from Jacob and started rushing towards the rat. It tackled me to the ground and screamed at me with its giant gaping mouth. I shook the bottle as well as I could and stuffed it into its mouth, acting quicker on this occasion to pull my hand back out. It swallowed the bomb and I winced in anticipation. As if on cue, the bomb exploded in the rat's throat and nearly decapitated it. It staggered over me for a few moments, as if trying to figure out why it had lost function of its whole body, before it tumbled to the floor and let out a long death gurgle. Thank God, I sighed as I crawled out from under it. Jacob was carefully opening the bottles to relieve their pressure. It turned out we only needed one after all. I walked over to him and shoved my face into his chest, letting a wave of emotions come over me as I began to cry uncontrollably into him. Everything bubbled to the surface at once. My fear of rats, my situation, my hopelessness, everything all came to the surface at once. I stood there crying into Jacob's chest for a good 5 minutes before I finally got some bit of composure back. The two of us made our way back down to the first floor and toward the main entrance. As we were about to leave, I looked back to see Jacob staring at his old picture again. I wondered what he could be thinking about, but I figured it was better not to dwell on that. So I simply opened the door and stepped back into Creole's shop.
Mace!
Goodness, girl, what happened to you? Creole asked in shock, which I couldn't tell if it was genuine or fake. He walked over to me and quickly grabbed my hand, removing Jacob's makeshift bandage to get a good look at it. Oh dear me, quite the nasty bite it gave you.
Huh?
He asked me, that stupid smile replaced with a look of concern on his face. Can you fix me, sir? I asked him as he looked at the hand and reached into his pocket. He wordlessly doused my hand in some potion, and I half expected my lost fingers to start blooming like some flower or something. But instead, the bleeding ceased completely. There we are. That should deal with any infection as well. Can't have my new toy breaking so soon after I bought it, he said with that stupid smile returning to his face. I stared back at him and felt my anger boiling over. I was his toy, no better than a frisbee he could throw around, and easily replaceable if he broke me too badly. What about my fingers? I asked him, wanting to know if he could do anything with them. He stared at them for a moment before letting go of my hand and shrugging. If I had them, I could sew them back on. Unfortunately, we don't have them, do we? He said with a smile that quickly grew sinister, as I was sure some other horrible idea had crossed his mind. I could always chop it off and give you a new hand, he said with a sinister snicker. I quickly held onto my hand and backed away from him. No, thank you. I'll manage with this, I told him as I turned to leave, surprised to see that Jacob had replaced his damaged uniform in the time I had been talking to Creole. Oh, Mace, my darling, you still can pick locks, can't you? I would hate for your injuries to end that hobby for you, Creole asked me as I kept my back to him. I looked down at my hand and bent my remaining fingers. It was doable. It would just take me a long time to get used to. Yes, sir, I told him, opening the front door and listening to the sad bell jingle its tone as I left the shop. I was sure that he was just looking for any reason to break me further and get rid of me, or he would finally get bored of me and get rid of me that way. Either way, I was resolved with one simple goal: free myself from King Creole by any means necessary. The first step to escaping Creole's grasp was getting used to only having a few working fingers on my left hand. I'm lucky to be right-handed, but you never really notice how often you use your left hand until it's heavily damaged, especially when you're a lockpicker and need full use of both hands. It was like learning all over again with more difficult locks. Once I finally got more accustomed to only having a few fingers on my hand, I next went about trying to free myself from Creole's grasp. My only possible source of information was the internet. Needless to say, I didn't get too many useful ideas. Most were from people role-playing or scamming me, and I was about to give up hope when on a whim I checked on the maps to see if anything there would pique my interest, and I was surprised to see that on the other side of town was a different voodoo shop. Mama DuPont's Voodoo Emporium? I asked aloud as I stared at the listing for it. It's got 4 stars, I said afterward, which made me feel a little stupid for immediately thinking that a rating would be helpful in my situation. It was a bit far for a walk, but if this place was going to be legit, it was worth the little ache I might get in my legs. I went into my bathroom and applied more ointment to my face. The ointment didn't work for my fingers, but it seemed to be endlessly refilling whenever I used it, so there was that little bright light in my shitty existence. As I finished, I heard someone enter my room. I poked my head out and stared at my dad awkwardly standing there. "Hey, Dad," I said as I did my best to avoid his gaze on me. I could tell he was thinking about the scars I had on my face. "I'm working on a way to fix all of this," I told him as I looked up to meet his eyes. I was surprised to see that he was crying again, and before I could even process it, he'd wrapped his arms around me and hugged me. "I'm so sorry, baby. I should have protected you from all of this. I never wanted anything bad to happen to you or your mother," he said as he clutched me tightly. I tried my best to hold back the tears, but once a single one streamed down my cheek, the others followed in rapid succession. "It's okay, Daddy." After a few seconds of us crying together, I pulled myself back and wiped my good eye. He wiped his own eyes and reached into his pocket, handing me a gun in its holster. I opened my eyes so wide that my glass eye fell out of my head and rattled to the floor. That caught him off guard, and he quickly looked away from me. "It's only a 22, so I doubt it'll kill him. But for anything else, I'm sure it'll be okay for self-defense. He waited for me to scramble around and plop my eye back into my head. Once that was done, he placed the gun in my hands and slowly backed away from me. "You remember how to use one, right?" he asked me. Dad had shown me how to shoot from a young age and had installed plenty of gun rules and disciplines into my head. I remember. I nodded as I pulled the gun from the holster and pulled the slide back to see if it was loaded. It wasn't, which made sense since my dad never stored his guns and ammo together. I walked over to my backpack and quickly stuffed the gun into it along with my various other items. He walked over and handed me a couple of magazines filled with 22s, and I also added them to my bag. "I'm going to a different voodoo shop. Maybe they'll be able to help us," I told my dad as I zipped up the bag and quickly swung it around my back. "You're going to solve our voodoo issue by going to a different voodoo shop?" my dad asked in complete disbelief. "That's like lighting another forest on fire to fight a different forest fire. Mace." He plopped his face into his hand and let out a groan. "To be fair, Daddy, the fires will eventually burn each other out. So maybe it'll work out," I said, still not fully believing in my own plan. But I sort of had to if it was going to work. I wrapped my arms around my dad again and flinched when he leaned in to kiss me on the cheek. "Stay safe. Macedonia, I couldn't stand to lose you." He pulled back and tousled my hair, getting me to giggle and nod up at him. I walked past him and was happy that my mom was working today. I didn't feel able to explain my voodoo crusade to her. I walked over to the front door and opened it, nearly having a heart attack when I saw Jacob standing at the door. "Jesus."
Fuck!
I shouted in surprise, quickly looking behind me and shoving the bellhop outside and closing the door behind me. "You scared the shit out of me, Jacob," I panted as I stared at him and crossed my arms in anger at him. He tilted his permanent smiling head a bit at me, and I stared up at him. And before I could get any angrier at him, he waved at me. That got a little snort out of me, and I sighed as I noticed the letter in his hand. That sucked all of the joy out of me. I extended my hand out to him, and he gently placed the envelope in my hand. I stared down at it, and instead of immediately opening it, I stuck it into my jacket pocket. "I'll be at the shop later today. Okay? I have something important to do first." I told him, to which he nodded and gave me a little salute. Everything that Jacob did just brought a smile to my face, and I gave him a little wave goodbye as we separated to go down our separate paths. I walked down the streets toward this new voodoo shop, and I began to take notice that it was in the nice part of town. Different from the houses I stole from in the suburbs, but still just as nice. It gave me a little bit of hope. Creole's voodoo shop was in the shitty part of town, and he was a psychopathic murderer. So could the owner of this new voodoo shop be a better person? I hoped that it would be the case as I checked my phone to make sure I was going the right way. After a half hour of walking, I could finally see the voodoo shop in my sight, and right away I could tell it was completely different from old King Creole's. Mama Dupont's Voodoo Emporium actually looked like a business that hadn't been abandoned for 50 years. Not to mention the store even had a more prominent sign. It felt inviting, and that filled me with a bit of comfort and also the courage to actually enter the store. A soft and comforting bell heralded my arrival, and I couldn't help but stare up at it in wonder. I'd heard Creole's sad and rusty bell so many times that I forgot that a bell could sound like that. I scanned my eyes across the store and was struck by how neat and organized everything was. It was like stepping into an antique shop that a little old lady ran and carefully cared for. "Do come in, sweetheart. I'll be with you momentarily." A soft and caring voice broke me out of my endless scanning of the store. I looked over towards where it had come from and saw a middle-aged black woman sitting at the counter. If this shop was an antique shop, then she was the little old lady who ran it. I watched her as she looked down at her hands cupped in front of her and just immediately wondered if she was a grandma in any way. "Sorry to intrude," I told her, holding the straps of my backpack tight and walking over toward the counter. The woman looked up at me and was suddenly horrified at what she saw. She quickly walked around the register counter and quickly walked over to me. "You poor thing. What's happened to you?" she asked me as she slowly raised a hand to where my glass eye was. I instinctively pulled away from her hand and couldn't help but look down at the floor in shame. "That's why I'm here," I told her, lifting my head to her and suddenly becoming aware of the thing she was holding in her hands. "What's that thing?" I asked as I pointed toward it. In her hands was a small little creature that looked almost like some kind of a bug. It had wings and antennas and also 5 colorful eyes, but it was wearing a hoodie and sweatpants. It also appeared to be crying and sniffling. Against my better judgment, I started getting closer to it with my finger. "Wait, I wouldn't..." The owner was in the middle of trying to stop me when the bug creature looked at me, opened its mouth, and chomped right down on my finger. I let out every obscenity I could think of as I pulled my finger away and left a decent chunk of skin behind in the bug's mouth. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. This creature scares and becomes emotional very easily," she told me as she reached over to one of the shelves near us and pulled out a small stuffed rabbit from the shelf. She lowered it down to the bug's level as it was busy chewing on my skin and hissing in my direction. When it became aware of the stuffed rabbit, however, its eyes literally lit up in excitement as it gave the rabbit a big squeeze hug, its wings flapping happily. "There, all better now," the voodoo shop owner said softly as she sat the bug on a shelf with its stuffed rabbit. "Now then, where are my manners? My mama would have killed me by now for being this rude to you." She giggled and lifted the ends of her dress a bit to bow at me. "I'm Mama Dupont, the owner of this lovely establishment." I was busy sucking on my finger to make it feel better, the gross taste of blood coating my tongue as I did so. I pulled my finger out and slowly bowed to her just to match her mannerisms. "I'm Macedonia, but please call me Mace. I need your help, really badly," I told her, and I could tell that she couldn't stop looking at my glass eye. It would certainly seem that way. She nodded as she walked over and carefully grabbed my hand and inspected the bite. "What has happened to you, my poor child?" she asked me as she produced a potion from seemingly nowhere and quickly began rubbing some of it onto my bite. "Do you know who King Creole is?" I asked her, and she immediately stopped everything she was doing. She looked at me with absolute horror in her eyes. She quickly dropped my hand and started muttering something in French. I was more than a little confused about that. I looked over to the bug to see if it was having the same reaction, but it had called asleep lying down in the rabbit's chest. "We don't speak his name. Es persona non grata," she told me as she grabbed my shoulders and gave them a soft squeeze. "He's the reason that you have all these terrible scars?" she asked me, and what I suspected was confirmed. "You can see them?" I asked as I instinctively went to rub the spot where I'd been stabbed by the junkie. She nodded and motioned for me to follow her to the register. I followed after her, looking down at my finger to see that the bleeding had stopped. Normal people can't see past his illusion, but I can see them clear as day. "You poor child. For him to use you in this way." She shook her head and quickly ducked behind her counter to begin looking for something. "Can you help me? I need to stop him before he kills me and my whole family." She quickly popped her head back up and laid out a few necklaces in front of me. She quickly took my hand again and looked down at my palm. Judging by her reaction, it didn't look like my future had much good in it. I can't personally become involved. If I do, well, needless to say, he won't be happy about that at all. Not to mention that horrible cabal of friends he has, she said as she let go of my hand and offered me one of the necklaces from the counter. "Like Sinclair?" I asked her. She nodded and looked at me. "I had a run-in with him. He seems lovely," I said sarcastically, and she couldn't help but give me a dry laugh. "If he has more friends like that, the sooner I get away from him, the better," I told her as I placed the necklace over my head. "That necklace will protect you from his magic, but not from physical attacks, so your best bet is to keep your distance. I do have a spell that could stop him for good, but unfortunately, I don't have the required ingredients. You did sort of spring this on me out of nowhere." She sighed as she reached under her counter again and pulled out a small bottle filled with a bright blue liquid. "What's that?" I asked as she gave it to me. "A cleansing potion. It'll break the contract hold he has over you and your family. All you have to do is drink it, but it'll only come into effect after 24 hours, she told me. and I nodded. This potion would finally free me from any obligation I had to him. "Thank you." "Ma'am, what do I owe you?" I asked, hoping that I didn't have to trade my soul to her as well. But she simply smiled and held my cheek in her hand. "You come back safely to me and buy a charm from my shop. That's what you owe me," she told me. I gripped the bottle and nodded, quickly stuffing the bottle into my bag and walking toward the exit. I got scared by the bug as it started hissing at me as I walked past it and its stuffed bunny. As I exited Mama Dupont's, I stuck my tongue out at it and started walking towards the half-priced voodoo store. As I was walking, I suddenly remembered the letter that Jacob had given me. I pulled it out of my jacket pocket and opened it, and immediately felt my blood freeze in my veins. It was 5 simple words, and yet it was enough to get me to drop the letter and start sprinting towards the voodoo shop. "I know what you're doing," it had told me. As I was running, I reached into my bag and pulled the potion out, quickly guzzling it down. If I was going to make it to 24 hours, I might as well start. As I entered the shitty part of town, I stopped to catch my breath and also pull the pistol out of my bag, quickly loading it and pulling the slide back. Loading a bullet into the action, I took some deep breaths to calm myself and to recuperate from my run. I hadn't run since back in high school, and it showed. I walked towards the voodoo shop and gripped the handle of the gun tightly in my hand. Stepping into the shop, I was immediately met with Jacob waiting by the door, and he quickly reached out and tried to grab the gun from me. I ducked away from him and pointed the gun at him with great hesitation. As much as I had come to love and care about him, I also had to remember that he was nothing but Creole's toy at the end of the day. He looked at me with that same smile and slowly raised his hands in surrender, holding up my bellhop. "How needlessly cruel of you, Mace." My sights were quickly trained toward Creole's voice, and I was surprised to see him standing just mere feet from me. I wasted no time and quickly squeezed the trigger of the pistol. I quickly unloaded 3 shots into Creole's face and sent him staggering backward. For a moment he stood still and motionless. His head snapped back at an almost 90-degree angle, but after a few seconds, he snapped his head back up, and I watched in horror as the small bullet holes in his face closed up before me. 22 mace? Why, that's hardly enough to kill a normal person. You really think that you can hurt lil ol' me with that?" he said with that stupid smile still present on his face. It was worth a shot. I groaned internally at my own stupid pun and kept the gun trained squarely on Creole's face. "I just need to survive 24 hours and I'll be rid of you anyway," I told him, backing up slightly as he began approaching me. His cane rhythmically tapped on the floor with every step he took toward me. "Oh, you won't have to worry about me, darling. I know all about you and Mama Dupont's business with each other. I didn't give you that glass eye just out of the kindness of my heart." He giggled as he tapped his own button eye. I reached a hand to my glass eye and suddenly became very aware of just how indebted to Creole I truly was. He'd given me a new eye and had saved me from bleeding out. "Besides, I'm not the one you should be pointing that thing at," Creole said as he lifted his cane and pointed it toward Jacob. I kept my gun trained on Creole as I followed where he was pointing at. Jacob was staring at me, and his button eyes slowly drifted toward Creole. It felt like he was apprehensive about what was going to happen. Creole, though, fixed him with an angry glance, and Jacob submissively looked down at the floor. Suddenly, a deep rumbling came from inside of him as the stitches and staples that held his head together split down the middle. Suddenly, a row of teeth appeared from inside his head, and a deep roar came from Jacob. "Oh fuck," I screamed as I quickly trained my gun on him and popped a few shots off as the Jacob monster lunged toward me. I managed to dodge out of the way as he charged straight into one of the shelves and knocked it over along with all of its contents. While Jacob was trapped under the shelf and its contents, I quickly turned around to face Creole and was just barely able to dodge a swing from his cane. "That charm she gave you may protect you from magic, but it ain't gonna do a damn thing against physical attacks," he told me through chuckles. As he took another swing at me, thinking quickly, right after I dodged, I aimed for his knees and quickly filled them with lead. He wasn't expecting that as he quickly tumbled to the ground in a heap. I took that time to quickly run to the back of the shop and into his office. Happy to see that he'd left the door open, I quickly ran in and shut the door behind me, just as I heard the Jacob monster finally emerging from under the shelf debris. I locked the office and quickly shoved the large chair he had against the door. I panted softly as I turned around. I was met with Creole staring down at me with an amused smile. Before I could raise my gun to shoot him, he quickly grabbed the gun from my hand and used his other one to bash me over the head with his cane. Now it was my turn to fall to the floor like a sack of potatoes. Clever, but not clever enough. Creole giggled as he walked over to his desk and left me trying to stand back up. But that blow had scrambled me real good, and it was like I was operating with a body that had inverted controls. I'd love nothing more than to kill you right now, or have Jacob eat you, or even turn you into a new shopkeeper. But I feel like playing a game with you, he said with a childlike giggle. He sat down on his chair and happily drummed his fingers on his desk as I finally regained some motor skills, at least enough to sit up. How about the go fuck yourself game? I like that one, I told him as I staggered up to my knees. That got a good giggle out of him as he adjusted his hat and smiled down at me with a look of superiority. Just then, the door to his office burst open and the Jacob monster came snarling in. Creole held a gloved hand up, and Jacob instantly froze in place as the two halves of his face fused back in the middle, and the normal Jacob returned to his old smiling self. No, I was thinking more like hide and seek, Creole said. He picked up the small bell on his desk and rang it, summoning Jacob to him, even though he was only a couple of feet away from him. Jacob walked over to him and bent down as Creole whispered into his ears. Jacob looked over at me and his brows went up in concern, but he nodded and left the two of us alone in the office. How about this? Mace, if you survive this little game, I'll allow you and your family to survive. Our contract becomes void and I leave you alone. I swear on my mother. He put his hand to his chest and raised his other hand. No tricks? No surprise bullshit? I asked him, not believing him in the slightest. He nodded and sat up in his chair. What's the rules? Do I gotta hide for 24 hours or something? I asked as the throbbing pain in my head continued. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If you dare to explore further, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more spine-tingling tales of horror and the supernatural. Remember, the shadows hold endless mysteries, waiting to be unveiled. Stay tuned for more bone-chilling stories as we continue to traverse the eerie depths of the unknown together. Until next time, may your dreams be free from the haunting echoes of our tales. Or perhaps not.